Picture this. You're a Japanese game developer in 2015. It's still a few years before the word suspicious loses all meaning to an entire generation of human beings, but you already know social deduction games are hitting a stride in the mainstream. Time for you and the boys to get a piece of that pie. So you think to yourself, why not adapt one of the most popular social deduction games of all time, Werewolf, sometimes known as Mafia. But hold on. It looks like indie studio Petit de Pato is already hard at work at their soon-to-be underrated game Nausea, so we have to do some innovating. And then it hits you. How about Werewolf? But actual werewolves, and time loops, and Japanese mysticism, and, waifus. Yeah, that ought to do it. Raging Loop is a game that you might have heard of. It's an adventure game slash visual novel about murder mysteries and time loops, and we're real into time loops here at the channel, so I can say with full honesty that I really wanted to like this game. Not to mention this thing has gotten rave reviews, so I had some high expectations going in. And when I finished the game, I came away with some pretty mixed feelings. When the game's good, it's pretty fucking good. And when it's bad, holy shit. So, we're gonna unpack this game, you and me, and see where this laundry list of good ideas took some wrong turns. If you've heard of this game and you've been wanting to play it for yourself, don't worry. We're not gonna get into spoilers until later in the video, and I'll warn you when we get there. So let's just dive right in. When you first start the game, you are greeted with Haruaki Fusaishi, better known as Pissman, a college student who just got broken up with and is trying to heal his broken heart on an aimless motorcycle trip through the mountains of Japan. Unfortunately, his heart isn't the only thing that's breaking because he crashes his motorbike into a river at the base of Mount Shinai. Lucky for him, he is found by a local love interest, Chiemi Serizawa, who lets you stay over at her place and get absolutely plastered. Turns out that Chiemi lives in the mountain village of Yasumizu, a rural town with a lot of folklore attached to it. When you wake up the following morning, Pissman's first mission is to go fix his bike, and while trying to do that, you meet some of the locals. There's a lot of them, but for right now, the only ones you need to know are the aforementioned Chiemi Serizawa, the rival love interest, a shrine maiden named Rikako, along with two of the village heads, the highly religious village grandmother Tae and the brusque de facto leader Kanzo, alongside his younger counterpart Takumi, the best boy in the game. With the help of Kanzo and Takumi, Pissman manages to retrieve his bike, but he isn't able to fix it, so you're stuck in town a little while longer. You spend the day getting to know the villagers a little, but it's made clear that everyone wants you to leave. Outsiders aren't exactly welcome guests in this town, and not everyone is as hospitable as Chiemi was. However, late that evening, just as night begins to fall, the mist rolls into Yasumizu. You see, the mist only comes once every few decades, and when it does, everyone in Yasumizu becomes trapped. Chiemi finds you and urges you to spend your second night in the village hiding in a nearby outhouse. You can't stay at her place again, for reasons you'll learn later, and if you wander outside at night when the mist comes, then you will be punished by the mountain spirits and killed. You see, this rural village has fallen victim to a folkloric curse, and with the coming of the mist, wolves have descended and infiltrated the populace. Not literal wolves, but spirits that can control a person and turn them into beasts. Per the law of the mountain, these wolves will kill one person each and every night until all of the humans are dead. The humans have the opportunity to defend themselves, but only by taking advantage of gifts bestowed upon them by the god of the mountain, Lord Shinai, and his guardian spirits, the monkey, the snake, the crow, and the spider. Each of these spirits can bestow unique gifts to a human villager. For example, the snake can ask the mountain spirits whether a specific person is a wolf once per night, and the spider can protect one person from harm, again, once per night. With the help of these spirits, the humans will gather daily for a so-called feast wherein they try to deduce who among them has been turned into a wolf and, eventually, kill the wolves via hanging. When one side is completely gone, be it humans or wolves, then and only then will the mist lift and the village be free from the mountain's ritual. As I mentioned at the start, this is a loose adaptation of the party game called Werewolf. For anyone unaware, Werewolf is a social deduction game wherein everyone draws cards and is randomly assigned an identity. Some are wolves, most are humans, and certain humans have special abilities like the aforementioned snake or spider. The game ends when the humans identify and eliminate the wolves, or the wolves successfully kill all the humans. So, it's a party game with a plot. What makes Raging Loop special? Well, let's talk story. During the feast, being suspicious is a death sentence. Hard evidence is a difficult thing to come by, so the daily hangings tend to be games of politics, and if you make others wary of you by saying the wrong thing, well, that could be it. Naturally, since Pissman is an outsider who just stumbled into town, he's very suspicious right from the start. And he's not the only one. Just before Pissman arrived at the village, a young girl named Meiko wandered in with no real knowledge of who she is or what she's doing. Add on to that the two traveling journalists, the food columnist Mamiya and her big boy photographer here. 4 outsiders, all now trapped in the village during this killing feast. Of course, our love interest doesn't want you involved in the feast at all, which is why she hides you in the outhouse overnight. It not only protects Pissman from being killed due to the mountain's rules about not being outside, but it also helps alleviate him from suspicion. That night, both of the journalists are killed by the mountain spirits. They didn't have love interests to shove them into toilets, so they were wandering around town and got themselves killed. And it's right about now that you are going to die for the first time. Yeah, see, Pissman doesn't survive this night. While you're in the outhouse, you hear the food journalist screaming and a choice pops up, either go outside and investigate, or don't. But the keen-eyed among you will notice that this isn't actually a choice at all because you can only pick one option, and that one option will get you killed. You see, even though this flowchart, which is a key part of Raging Loop, implies a wide-ranging means of approaching the story, especially seeing many players will likely be familiar with a similar mechanic in the ever-popular Virtue's Last Reward, the truth is that the story is still fairly linear. While you have the opportunity to make several choices throughout the game, many of these choices are gated behind locks, and you can only pick one of these choices when you find a key with a corresponding number. These keys are essentially information that you can pick up during a loop, and when you find a key, you can return to a point in that loop where that information could be useful, and make a different choice based on that. It's a quite cleverly implemented mechanic, but I want to make sure you know what you're getting into if you decide to play this for yourself. This is a linear story you're following, and you don't have control over the outcomes and who lives or who dies other than yourself. You can get yourself killed several times. In fact, you'll have to, because most keys are gated behind bad ends just like this one. You might also notice that when you do go outside and get killed, the key you receive is labeled number 2, even though this is the first key you get. That's because key number 1 is something you won't be receiving for a very long time, so that blank space can just taunt you every single time you open your key list. But anyway, once you get your first bad end and collect your key, you can go back to this choice at the outhouse, and now the option to stay inside is unlocked. When Pissman leaves the outhouse the following morning, he learns about the gruesome fates of the 2 journalists and insists on calling the police. Of course, that's not an option. The mist is near impenetrable and the village is well outside the range of cell service. Adding on to that, the van the journalists arrived in, as well as Pissman's bike, were both destroyed overnight. So you're stuck. Luckily, we get to meet up with a local love interest, Chiemi Serizawa, right after this. Chiemi found a symbol indicating that there are 2 wolves in the village. See, each of these little diamond shapes represents a wolf, so since there are 2 diamonds here, there are 2 wolves in the village. This brings us back to the feast, which is the highlight of Raging Loop. Non-stop back and forth theorizing until a wolf is found. Unfortunately, Pissman won't be taking part in today's feast because Chiemi has argued in his favor. You see, the rule about going outside at night isn't the only rule of the mountain. Each person in the village has to follow 3 rules at night: purify, shelter, and dream. You need to wash your body, take shelter in a single room, and go to bed when night comes. Through the mountain's supernatural effects, anyone who does this will inevitably fall asleep until dawn. Since Pissman didn't bathe and didn't sleep, the villagers assume that he should have been killed by the mountain. Since he survives, Chiemi argues that the mountain does not consider him as part of the feast, and thus, it wouldn't be possible for him to be a wolf anyway. Although reluctant, the villagers are eventually convinced by this and decide that Pissman is innocent. However, for safety reasons, they lock him away until the feast is finished. Of course, you might see the problem here already. The most interesting part of the game, the feast, is going on without Pissman's involvement, so for these first feast scenes alone, the story leaves Pissman's perspective. Pissman remains locked away and we switch to a third-person perspective of the feast. And I'll say this, even though I have my gripes with Raging Loop, the game is worth playing for these scenes alone. Each feast is an incredible read, and it really showcases how talented the writers can be when it comes to these huge group dialogues. Also, the feast comes with this absolute banger of a soundtrack. Listen to this shit. There's a lot of great tracks in Raging Loop, but this one is my favorite by far. But anyway, since we're at a group scene, we should go over the other characters. As you might be able to tell, the characters are seated in a way roughly corresponding to their ages. On the far left is the resident insane mute. No one knows his name, so everyone calls him the old man who cried wolf, or the old wolf man. He never says much, so we'll just move past him. Then there's Kanzo, Taya, and Takumi, who we went over before. And after that is Kaori, a mother and widow who serves as a village cook. She has a tenuous romantic relationship with Takumi back here, but neither of them act on their feelings. After her is Nosato, that's his last name by the way, but I'm not saying Kiyonosuke all video. He's a wealthy member of a different village on the other side of the mountain, Kamifujiyoshi. He lives in a huge mansion in Yasumizu, acting as a kind of liaison between the two villages. He also hates everyone who lives in Yasumizu except for the Shrine Maiden, keep that in mind, put a pin in that. After him are Kaori's two sons, the academic Yasunaga and the delinquent Yoshitsugu, stereotypical feuding brothers, and middle schoolers. Well, one's a high schooler, but it's not this one. Moving on, behind them is one of their schoolmates, Mochi, and he is a whole bag of problems we'll get into later, put a pin in Mochi. After them are the love interest, Chiemi and Rikako, and then Haru, a schoolmate of the three boys, Kanzo's granddaughter, and the best girl in the game. Finally, we have the lost little girl, Meiko. Like the old wolf man, she doesn't say much, so don't pay her too much mind just yet. The rules of the feast are as follows. Owing to the symbol Chiemi found earlier, we know that there are 2 wolves in this group. In addition, there are 5 other characters who are guaranteed to be humans because they have the power of one of the mountain's guardian spirits. As mentioned, the snake is able to determine whether an individual is a wolf or human once per night. Once someone is hanged, the crow is able to determine whether the corpse belonged to a wolf or human again, once per night. The spider is able to choose one person to protect once per night, guaranteeing their survival and also potentially wasting the wolves' ability to kill. If the wolves try to kill someone protected by the spider, then they will be forced to retreat for the night, meaning that they will be unable to kill anyone until the next day. Finally, the spirit of the monkey belongs to 2 characters. The 2 monkeys don't have any special abilities like the other spirits, but both monkeys know who the other monkey is, meaning they can vouch for each other's humanity. Of course, the only way the other humans at the feast will know which spirit belongs to which person is if that person decides to reveal their spirit, otherwise it all remains a mystery. During this first feast, you get an introduction to the relationships and dynamics between the villagers. Kanzo was a forceful leader who maintained a strong influence in the feast. There's an uneasy trust between the elders and the younger generation, which is primarily mediated through Takumi since his charisma and age makes him liked by both sides. These 5 over here have a close relationship as they grew up in the village together, while Nosato and Rikako are both generally disliked for being more a part of the other village on the mountain than a part of Yasumizu. Since this first feast is happening before the wolves have had the opportunity to kill anyone, it's ultimately decided that no one will be hanged quite yet, which turns out to be a bad decision because the next morning the gang finds 2 people dead, the delinquent, who was killed by the mountain spirits for roaming around at night, and Kanzo, who was killed by the wolves. Things go from bad to worse in the next feast. Takumi, who had outed himself as the snake, confirms Nosato's humanity. Afterwards, Nosato takes control of the feast and insists on hanging at least one person before the day ends. Since there are still no obvious culprits, the group puts the hanging to a vote, which leads to the largely useless old wolfman being chosen. He asks for time to get a few things ready, and he mysteriously winds up dead an hour later, alongside Mochi. That night, Takumi is killed by the wolves, his corpse is found the following morning. Not only that, but the Shrine Maiden Rikako seems to have been infected by the mountain's corruption. She's alive, but acting like a wild animal, so the villagers leave her locked in her room for the day. Later at lunch, the mother Kaori goes mad due to the delinquent's death and attempts to poison everyone using the food. Unfortunately for her, Nosato back here comes from a family of herbalist doctors, and identifies the poisonous wolfsbane before anyone eats it. In a last-ditch effort, she tries to stab everyone with a knife, which just leads to her getting tied up as everyone moves on to the feast, and as you can see, it's pretty much over at this point. The number of people here has dwindled to a mere 6, not counting Kaori and Rikako, both of whom are tied up in other parts of the village, and of course, with great reluctance, Kaori is the one who gets voted off. The group goes to hang her, and this scene comes with another fantastic music track. It really sounds like a solemn march towards what no one wants to do, but everyone knows they have to do. So everything's gone to shit, and Pissman says fuck it. He goes to Chiemi's room and tells her he's leaving with Meiko in the morning. He wants Chiemi to come with him, but she's skeptical as she fears the power of God will seek divine retribution on her. Oh wait, someone's at the door. Oh shit! Turns out that's God, at least as far as Chiemi is concerned. God has shown up to say something ominous and then bounces, and Pissman decides not to think about it too much. Now, I'll preface what I'm about to say, which is that we're about to get into spoilers, and you might be thinking, wasn't everything from the last 10 minutes or so already spoiler territory? And no, not quite yet. We just finished Chapter 3, and the game itself considers spoiler territory to begin at the start of Chapter 4. So if you found everything that we've been going through so far interesting, then go get yourself a copy. You can find this on Steam for like $30. Spoiler warning! Okay, so I'm gonna bring up something real quick. The first scene of this game isn't actually you crashing your bike into the river. Before that happens, Pissman stops into a convenience store and asks for directions from this cashier here. And I didn't bring this up earlier because this cashier is the worst character in the entire game for reasons that we will be getting into much later, but just keep that in mind. Anyway, back to where we were. After our meeting with God, Pissman goes to sleep for the night, and in the morning he makes his way to the dining hall to meet up with Chiemi. The two learn that Nosato was killed and go to look for Meiko, only to learn that she has been taken hostage by the remaining three characters, Yasunaga, Tae, and Haru. Now hold on, there are only two wolves, right? So what's going on here? Well, it turns out that the real wolves, the killers behind it all, were Yasunaga and Tae. The two explain their reasoning in the massacre. According to village folklore, the true monsters are the humans who have been infected by malevolent spirits. By killing each person in the feast, the wolves were bringing them salvation. Haru got a visit from the wolf god Okami-sama after Kanzo's death, which is not the same god that visited us last night. There's a lot of gods in this, just to be clear. And Okami-sama informed her of all of this, and she chose to betray the humans to join the cause of saving them from damnation. So, if you remember that the feast is decided via vote, the wolves have 3 votes on their side, and the humans have only Chiemi and Meiko. In other words, the wolves have already won. So Pissman grabs the 2 girls, and the 3 of them book it out of the village. When they get to the edge of the village, they struggle to see through the mist and the wolves catch up to them. Pissman loses sight of Meiko and Chiemi, disintegrates? Sure, why not? Eventually the wolves find Pissman and kill him, and that's the end of Act 1. We're left with a lot of questions, so I'm gonna get into something to help us out. We'll go over this in more detail later, but there are parts of this game that are hidden behind a setting called Revelation Mode, which is unlocked after beating the game for the first time. What this mode does is unlock extra scenes that you couldn't see your first time through, and I'm going to cover one of those scenes here. While Pissman does try to escape the wolves and ultimately gets himself killed at the end of this first time loop, things aren't exactly as they seem. Per Revelation Mode, we learn 2 more things. First, even though Meiko got separated, she's actually completely fine because she has some kind of spirit attached to her, which she calls the Black Goat, which protects her from harm. This is not a spoiler for the ending of the game, by the way. You never learned this information during your first playthrough, regardless of whether you got the true ending or not. Put a pin in that. The second thing is that you might assume from this CG that Yasunaga, Tae, and Haru have chased Pissman into the mist and ultimately killed him. This is also not the case. With Revelation Mode, we see how things really played out. That being that these 3 never left the dining hall. Furthermore, Yasunaga is dedicated to saving Haru, and for whatever reason thought the best way to do that was winning the feast, then killing Tae, and then himself, leaving Haru as the only survivor in Yasumizu. While I won't be bringing up Revelation Mode content too often, I will be mentioning it if it gives us relevant scenes like these. And also, I'm gonna spoil one more thing that you normally don't learn until a few hours into the next time loop, but there's a secret 5th guardian spirit, unrelated to the monkey, spider, crow, and snake, and that guardian is the badger. The badger is basically a traitorous human who is on the wolf's side. That's what Haru was this time around. Also, while most people receive their guardian spirits on the first night of the mist, the badger spirit doesn't come until the second night. Just keep all that in mind. Anyway, Pissman is dead, time to rewind. Actually, one more thing before we do. Some of you might remember that Rikako went insane a little while ago and everyone decided to just lock her in a room until they finished the feast, and then she didn't get brought up again for the rest of the story. So if you were curious about what happened to her, they just left her there and she eventually starved to death. Fun times. Anyway, where's that rewind button? When you start the game, you're greeted with Pissman, a hardcore biker and noted water sports enthusiast, nursing a broken heart in the haunted mountains of Japan. All of a sudden, he gets a flood of memories from another world about being brutally murdered in a nearby village called Yasumizu. Determined to figure things out this time around, Pissman takes the long road into town so that he can actually participate in the feast this time, and we get to one of the most annoying scenes in this game. You see, in order to get to Yasumizu, you have to go through this police officer here, and the only way to do that is to get 3 bad ends in the space of 10 minutes to collect 3 keys and make the special decision to get drunk before talking to the police officer, which leads to you spending the night in the drunk tank and subsequently getting into a mind-blowingly convenient sequence of contrivances, during which you meet the officer's wife as well as one of Yasumizu's less important family heads, who offers Pissman the opportunity to permanently move to Yasumizu, giving him an air of legitimacy in the feast since he is no longer categorized as an outsider. He joins the journalists from before, who just so happen to be on their way into the village, and with all that nonsense done, we are ready to begin Act 2. Fortune follows us further as the shrine maiden Rikako takes us to a spare house we can use since we're now a resident. On the way there, she fills us in on some more lore. The guardians of the feast, the monkey, the spider, the snake, and the crow, are all related to the family heads of the village. Rikako herself is the last of her family and the de facto head representing the spider. Our wealthy friend Nosato is part of the crow family. The mother Kaori had married into the Higuchi family representing the monkey, though of course her husband is dead at this point. And finally there's the Migurumas representing the snake. Put a pin in the Migurumas, they'll be important soon enough. We're really racking up these pins, aren't we? Basically, each of these families has a certain trade they began practicing centuries past and have carried on into the modern day. You'll remember that Nosato could identify the poison in the food because of his background in medicine. This is because his family were historically the village healers. Similarly, the Higuchi family were responsible for feeding the village, which is why Kaori makes everyone's food each day. As for the other 2 families, well, we'll deal with them later. And despite the fact that these families are related to the guardian spirits, this doesn't actually have any effect on who gets chosen for a guardian during the feast. That's completely random. But anyway, Pissman has another problem to deal with: the journalists. Recall that in the first arc, the journalists were killed immediately because they didn't have a place to stay. Since they planned on leaving the following morning, they stayed in their van overnight, leading to them being killed by the mountain spirits for being outside. So, in order to prevent this from happening again, Pissman slashes the van's tires so that the journalists are forced to stay somewhere in the village. Nosato informs us that there's an abandoned prefab in the village for our photographer friend, and there's an extra room in the student housing for the food journalist. By the way, this conversation we have with Nosato about the abandoned prefab will eventually turn out to be one of the most important turning points in the game, but only once we have the right keys to unlock a choice here. For now, the mist has come, and it's time for bed. When we get up in the morning, we learn 3 things. 1, Pissman has a guardian this time, the snake. 2nd, the photographer was wandering around outside and wound up dead, again. And 3rd, there are 3 wolves this time around instead of just 2. Factor in the badger, and things are not looking good right from the start. But regardless, it is time for the feast, now with 2 additions, Pissman and the surviving journalist Mamiya. Since we're here this time, we get to hear more lore about the spirits, which basically boils down to the guardian spirits helping ancient humans fend off the wolf god Okami-sama by tricking him into getting drunk and throwing him into the Saranaga River. When the mist flows in from the river every few decades, it is the wolf god Okami coming back to consume humans and regain his power, unless he is driven back into the river via the hangings of the feast. And after a bit more exposition, we get into the meat of things. We may have the power of the snake, but we keep that hidden for the time being. Kanzo and Yasunaga reveal themselves as monkeys, so at the very least the wolves don't have Yasunaga leading the way this time around. When voting time comes, just like in the first arc, no one is chosen for hanging just yet. We spend the rest of the day getting lore dumps from the journalist who used to dabble in the occult and has become interested in the legends behind Yasumizu and the feast. After that it's bedtime, and as we're the snake, we can ask the mountain whether someone is a wolf or a human. We're given 3 choices: Takumi, Nosato, and Mamiya. Strictly speaking, it doesn't matter which one you pick, your answer to this choice will either get you key 10, key 11, or key 12, but the story will play out the same until you get to a choice much later where you're going to need to have all 3 of these keys in order to progress. So you'll be doing a lot of going back and forth on the chart here to collect all 3 keys, and let me tell you something, the UI in this game fucking sucks. Like, I get this was clearly designed for a mobile game experience, so if you're on Switch or something, this might be more tolerable. Like, these buttons were clearly mobile game buttons, right? Was this a mobile game? Oh yeah, it was, I was right. But look at this. I'm scrolling my scroll wheel as hard as I can, and this shit is barely moving. The flowchart works fine in VLR, why isn't it working here? Navigating this flowchart and pretty much anywhere else you have to scroll in the UI takes absolutely forever, and I don't understand how it's this terrible because if you scroll through the text history, it works just fine, just as you'd expect, but navigating this core game mechanic is an absolute slog. Or you could take this text speed slider, which isn't a slider at all like it would be in a good game, but is more a radio button disguised as a slider, letting you choose from one of like 5 speeds. This is what a radio button is, by the way, in case you didn't know the name. Anyway, what you can learn from your snake investigations is this. Takumi is a human, Nosato is a human, and surprise surprise, our friend Mamiya the food journalist is a wolf. On the bright side, no one died last night. The person the wolves tried to kill was protected by the spider, meaning the wolves wasted a night. You might be wondering, if it's possible to figure out that Mamiya is a wolf through your snake investigation, then how is it possible that the exact same story plays out even if you didn't investigate her? And the answer to that is because as soon as the next feast starts, Mamiya claims that she is the snake. You see, the writing is clever when it needs to be, in that they're able to create a hefty illusion of choice out of linearity. It's really quite impressive. Since Mamiya claims the role of the snake, and Pissman is the snake, then you know that Mamiya is a wolf right away, even if you didn't investigate her. If there's any part of the writing of this game that I can give high praise to, it's this. There's some real talent in being able to create such an effective illusion of choice. Of course, since Mamiya claims the role of the snake, the question is raised by the others as to whether she's telling the truth. You can reveal that you're the real snake, but if you do that, then the wolves will just kill you the next night, so, don't do that. If you keep quiet, then Mamiya will accuse the old lady Tai of being a wolf, which eventually leads to her being voted off. Of note here, during the vote, Pissman doesn't vote for Tai, but votes for Takumi. When questioned as to why, he says that he wants to protect Takumi, but doesn't elaborate further. Afterwards is when we get to one of the strongest performances in terms of voice acting. Takumi was raised by Taya, even though the two aren't related by blood, so when the villagers go out to hang her, Takumi sings the ritual prayer of the mountain, and the delivery is fantastic.
信さんのお守りはいかがちふましらみがらすよも
That shaky but resolute voice carries a lot of emotional weight. Takumi may not be the most important character in the game, but his voice acting is some of the best out of the entire cast. Actually, the quality of voice acting ranges quite a bit across characters. Not in terms of performance, those are all pretty good across the board. The difference is really in mic quality and how each character's voice is mixed. I don't know anything concrete about the production behind this game, but they probably didn't have a big recording studio to do group sessions in or anything. The company behind Raging Loop is pretty small, and the seiyus are all fairly unknown. The man behind Takumi is Saito Takuya, and this is his first and only role in a visual novel. Actually, this is everyone's first and only VA credit with the exception of Rikako's voice, who also shows up in Fatal 12, but other than that, this is all green talent, and I don't know where they found these people. As a result of this inexperience though, I think everyone on the team was just kind of figuring things out as they went. For example, there's a scene early in the first loop when the mist starts rolling into Yasumizu and everyone is panicking. The scene focuses on Pissman, Chiyomi, and Takumi, and there's a pretty loud background track playing. Now, you can hear Pissman's voice just fine, but both Chiyomi and Takumi are completely buried in the mix.
どこへ行ってたの？
ごめん。すぐ作業に戻るから。
何言ってるの？もうダメ、間に合わない。春秋さんも隠れて。
何やってんだ、チエミ。とっとと部屋に戻れ。で
も春秋さんが。
ほっとけ、そんなよそ者。俺はおやっさんと他の連中んち回るから絶対戻れよ、チエミ。
But if you're playing with Revelation mode on, there's a few added lines of dialogue for Chiyomi, and there's a stark difference between the original voice acting and the Revelation mode voice acting, which I'm assuming was recorded after the main story content was already done.
どこへ行ってたの？
ごめん。すぐ作業に戻るから。
何言ってるの？もうダメ、間に合わない。春秋さんも隠れて。隠れる？家がなきゃ物意味はできない。間宮さんたちと同じにこの人も汚れでズタズタにされる。
You see? This isn't really a criticism, by the way, it's more just something I noticed. I can only assume that by the time they got around to recording for Revelation mode, everyone was much more comfortable with their roles and equipment than they were when they first started voicing the project. It's kinda cute in a way how the game grows with its talent. The only time this is really a problem is with the delinquent character and the old lady. The delinquent is supposed to be shouting most of the time, but because he's mixed so low, his shouting is even quieter than Pissman's normal dialogue. And with Tae as an elderly woman, her voice is already supposed to be fairly soft, so with the low mix, anytime there's music playing, it's practically impossible to hear her.
狼様がお二人を血戻られた。
Granted, the options menu is robust enough that you can adjust each character's volume as you see fit. If there's one point of praise I can give the UI, it's that. So you can kind of alleviate this issue, but the fact that this problem is present on the default settings is just a point of bad polish. Before we go to bed, we get stopped by the students and...
はるちゃん、もうやったとは何？
僕がもうやったから。
はるちゃん、何のこと？
ああ、もしかして、はるちゃんは昨日近くで話を聞いてたのかな？
昨日は3人でとっとと戻ったよ。その後、一人でなんか聞きに行ったの？
はるちゃん？
そうか。落ちてきたか。己、幾度かやり直しておるな。
Turns out, Haru knows you're time looping. Somehow. But Mochi stops us from learning anything more. Luckily, our newest love interest, Rikako, pops up to let us know that this is just something Haru does. The Nosato family believes it to be mental illness, but regardless, she used to roleplay as if she were possessed, and what she said to Pissman is an extension of that. But, I mean, obviously not. Bedtime rolls around, and we now have 5 options to choose from in our snake investigation. We can pick any of the 3 from the last time, but we can also choose Mochi or Haru. Again, this choice doesn't really matter. Wake up in the morning and oh no, best girl is dead. Oh, and Mamiya too. She was evidently betrayed by the other wolves and killed during the night. The killing of Haru was a calculated move on the part of the wolves. Kanzo was extremely attached to her, being his granddaughter and all, so the death cripples his leadership abilities during the feast as he becomes singularly focused on revenge. Before we get to today's feast, Takumi confronts Pissman about what he meant when he said he was trying to save Takumi with his vote, so Pissman reveals his hand, informing Takumi that he is the snake. Because Mamiya claimed the role of snake so early on, Pissman comes to the conclusion that the wolves were using her as bait to lure out the real snake. Furthermore, Pissman knew Takumi's fragile state in the wake of Tae's death meant it was likely that Takumi would try to kill the people who voted for Tae as a form of revenge, regardless of the fact that the mountain's corruption would kill him as a result. With such a strange move, Pissman was able to prevent Takumi from carrying out that revenge until he understood Pissman's reasoning, which did essentially save his life. With all that said, Pissman and Takumi form a plan to tip the scales in their favor and find the remaining 2 wolves. And that plan is a fixed majority. Essentially, the idea is to create a situation wherein it is impossible for the human side to lose. They might sustain a few casualties, but they'll be able to eventually vote the wolves out, regardless, by sheer numbers. At the feast, the mother Kaori reveals that she is the crow and confirms that Tae was a human. Afterwards, Pissman reveals that he is a snake to everyone else and informs them that Takumi and Nosato are both human. With Kanzo, Yasunaga, Takumi, Kaori, Nosato, and Pissman all confirmed to be human, there are 6 guaranteed humans and 6 unknowns. Even if the wolves killed one of the humans overnight, Pissman is guaranteed to survive since the spider will protect the snake, and of course one of the unknowns will be hanged when today's feast is over. Thus, when Pissman uses his snake powers that night, there will be 1 more guaranteed human or a guaranteed wolf, and even if he doesn't find a wolf, the addition of another human means that there will again be 6 guaranteed humans the next day, with only 4 unknowns remaining. At that point, the humans will have a majority, and the chance of the wolves winning becomes next to 0, regardless of who gets hanged in the feast to follow. During this feast, though, we learn something interesting. This isn't Kanzo's first experience with the feasts. It's his 3rd. And he's not alone. Both he and the old wolfman were involved in feasts a long time ago, and in the last one, they were the only 2 survivors. The old wolfman is chosen to be hanged, just like in the last loop, and he asks for some time to prepare things before he dies. However, Kanzo punches him and drags him outside, saying that he will hang the old man himself. And here's another scene that you're only going to see in Revelation mode. On your first run through this, you can only assume that Kanzo is doing exactly what he said, hanging the wolfman, since Kanzo comes back shortly afterwards claiming that he did exactly that. In Revelation mode, you can see that Kanzo actually just dragged him into the mist and started punching him. When the old man asked for time, Kanzo realized that he was faking being senile, and figures that the old man was a wolf in the feast that they both survived before this. So he beats the old man to death and then lops off his head and tosses his body into the river. Fun stuff. After the feast, Kaori starts making dinner. While everyone's waiting, Pissman has a conversation with Nosato about the Shrine Maiden. You may have picked up the very subtle hints, but Nosato has long had romantic feelings for the Shrine Maiden, though he hasn't acted on them since he believes he is not worthy of doing so, since Rikako is the head of her family and Nosato is not the head of his own, because he is the second-born son. What he does here is warn Pissman about a certain aspect of Rikako. Just as the role of the Nosato family was as the village healers, Rikako's family had its own role, that of the obtusely translated bedroom woman servant. He doesn't elaborate on what that means, but I think you can probably come to certain conclusions yourself based on the name. But you don't have to wonder about it for too long, because as soon as Kaori serves the food, we learn that it has once again been poisoned, and this time we are on the receiving end. Pissman immediately starts dying, but this isn't a bad end, no. Instead of actually dying, we learn the true power of the bedroom woman servant. Rikako is capable of quote-unquote taking in corruption, as she calls it, in this case meaning that she can magic away the poison in Pissman's body. And how else would she do that than, we'll take a look. So you wake up 5 hours later, no worse for wear. Everyone is obviously suspicious of Kaori, believing that she poisoned Pissman intentionally for being the snake, but they can't come to any conclusions, and Kanzo says they'll figure it out in the next day's feast. Time for bed, and this go around, you don't get to choose who you investigate. Pissman decides on his own that he will investigate the delinquent Yoshitsugu. Doing this will cinch the fixed majority that Pissman and Takumi are aiming for. Right before you fall asleep, you hear a knock on the door, and I'm just gonna come out and say something. The romance in this game sucks. It's absolute shit. 1. There shouldn't be romance in this game. I know this is something that everyone and their dog complains about, but not every story needs a romantic subplot, and this is one of them. In fact, this is doubly true for visual novels because I can count the number of non-romance visual novels with well-written romantic subplots on a closed fist. But 2, it's not like it's bad just because the romantic subplot exists. If this game had the whole romance arc with just Chiyomi, then I probably wouldn't have minded. But it's the fact that it's not just Chiyomi. It's almost like they remember they were making a visual novel and thought, well, can't have a visual novel without two girls fighting for your affection all game. A lot of text is dedicated to this romantic feud between Chiyomi and Rikako, even more if you're playing in Revelation mode. And the way the game opts to explore these love interests is by having Pissman be in love with Chiyomi in the first loop, Rikako in the second loop, and Haru the 15-year-old in the third loop. Pissman is 24, by the way. Now, Chiyomi is the main love interest, so you end up with her when the game ends regardless, but if that's the case, then all this romantic dialogue between Pissman and Rikako or Haru shouldn't be in the game at all. Why is this here? Genuine question. What does this add to the game? Is this just because visual novels usually have routes and this was their piss-poor means of implementing that? The medium of visual novels is so ripe for experimentation and interesting storytelling, so why are we falling back on tropes like a checklist here? If you want to have romance, then you can get enough of that with just Chiyomi, and arguably it works due to some stuff we'll cover later in the video, but there's really nothing gained by having Rikako and Haru spend just as much text fawning over Pissman when there's murder happening. That's what the whole scene here is. Chiyomi comes by and knocks on the door to cry about how much she loves Pissman, and Pissman thinks, well, that's nice, but I'm in love with the Shrine Maiden in this loop for no adequately explored reason. There's no character building here, there's no anything here. It is purposeless on its face, padding out a story that is already in dire need of some cuts. Moving on. Morning comes, and this is one of my favorite days in the entire game. We learn from our snake investigation that Yasunaga is a human, so the fixed majority is in place, and the humans have effectively guaranteed victory. However, Kaori was killed by the wolves overnight, but she didn't die quietly. She left a message. Her fingers were arranged so that on her right hand, her pinky finger and ring finger were squeezed together, and on her left hand, all of her fingers except her thumb were squeezed together. This was a message intended for her sons to figure out, which leads to another strong point in the writing. The story of the feuding brothers may be a tired one, but there's a lot of emotional resonance in this scene, where the two brothers find Kaori's corpse and let out their true feelings. The way these brothers yell at each other about their mother's love and how they eventually begin to reconcile like she always wanted them to is powerful, especially paired with the voice acting. But Yoshitsugu knows that Kaori left a second part to this message, one that she wrote down and then swallowed. Yoshitsugu fishes the note from her corpse, and it's time for the last feast. Yasunaga immediately brings up Kaori's message. The note she swallowed was a list of names with associated numbers. The implication is that these numbers will line up with the fingers that she had out. In this case, Kaori's fingers indicate that Mochi and Rikako are the wolves. Yasunaga is content with this alone. He even tricks Mochi into revealing that he knew Kaori's body was cut to pieces when he wouldn't have had any way of knowing that, since he didn't look at the body. This cements Mochi's guilt. However, Rikako's guilt is another question. Pissman realizes that this was a trap set by the wolves. Kaori did plan all of this, of course, but the positioning of her fingers is suspect, and Pissman believes that the wolves learned of Kaori's plan, fished the note out of her body to learn which number belonged to which name, put the note back, and rearranged her fingers so that Rikako was implicated as guilty. The reasoning behind this is quite clever. Kaori's hands were the only part of her body other than her head which wasn't slashed to bits. Furthermore, since her arms were slashed, it would be hard if not impossible for her to arrange her fingers how she'd want, since the muscles and tendons that controlled the fingers had been cut. Finally, when Yoshitsugu retrieved the note, he found it in the trachea instead of the esophagus. If you skipped bio class, the trachea is for breathing while the esophagus is for eating. So if she swallowed the note before going to sleep, it wouldn't have gone through the trachea to begin with. Because of all of this, Pissman concludes that the wolves figured out Kaori's plan and manipulated it to shift suspicion to Rikako, which leaves us with the real culprits, Mochi and Chiemi. Realizing that they've been outed, they decide to go scorched earth and kill everyone in the room.
やるとしようよ。
Whoopsie. But you know the deal. Get your key, go back in time. But since we're here, let's talk about Pissman for a bit. Part of what makes Pissman an engaging protagonist is that he's a piece of shit, or what the edgy among you might call morally gray. And this isn't even really a character judgment, he admits this himself. He's generally a fairly likable protagonist, but he has his moments, like in this loop when Chiemi and Mochi are revealed to be the wolves. You use your looping powers to preemptively remove the bullets from their guns so that they can't enact their massacre at the end of the timeline. The two get overpowered and tied up by the villagers, and Kanzo wants to stick to the 1 death per day rule, hanging one of them now and saving the other for the day after. And Pissman suggests that whichever one they don't hang, they cut the limbs off of so they can't try anything overnight, which leads to everyone in the room going, But Pissman does have more going for him than just being interesting. Pissman is an unusually talented thinker for someone who isn't a detective, more so than a lot of comparable mystery fiction protagonists. You get to see his train of thought in action to an almost excessive degree, which is fun to read, especially if your favorite part of Death Note was all the internal monologuing that they do.
You sure talk a lot, don't you, Light? Typical for someone who hates losing. Your respect for your father's matched only by your strong sense of justice. This time I'd say it's more than 70%.
But it also paints the story in a certain light. The fact is, there's nothing misleading in the narration. When Pissman comes to a conclusion, you can be safe in the knowledge that he is right, and the game isn't trying to pull some reverse psychology trick on you. And this is regardless of whether Pissman's theories have been confirmed in the story or not. When Pissman thinks he's figured something out, just assume that he is correct, because he always is. Now, this is broadly speaking a weak point for the story. It effectively prevents the reader from being surprised by some twists or reveals, since Pissman reveals them to you early on. Where this kind of writing can shine is on day 3 of the second loop, which was the day before this massacre that Chiemi and Mochi do. To refresh your memory, at this point the big boy photographer, the food journalist, the old woman, and Haru are all dead. Pissman himself is the snake, and the monkeys are Kanzo and Yasunaga. On the day 3 feast, Kaori reveals herself as the crow, and at this point you, the reader, can already deduce who the wolves are on your own by sheer process of elimination. Per your own investigations, you already know that Takumi and Nosato are human, which leaves only Mochi, the shrine maiden, the little girl, the delinquent, and the love interest. Because of Pissman's narration, you can safely assume that the delinquent is human, the little girl is the spider, and the shrine maiden is a human protecting/guiding the little girl. That leaves only Mochi and Chiemi as potential suspects, and what do you know, that's exactly the case. And you can come to this conclusion several hours before Pissman does. It's the only time in which Pissman fails to be the ever-vigilant protagonist. It takes him a very long time to figure this out, and I tend to believe that this is because he didn't want to accept that Chiemi was a wolf this time around. I mean, I'd like to think that, but the love triangle pivots in this loop, so Pissman's into the shrine maiden now, so you know, probably unintentional. Just bad plotting. If I did have to say something bad about Pissman though, it's that he's very self-assured in a kind of annoying way, and I can't tell if this is a way of commenting on the tropiness of some of Raging Loop's characters or not. This comes most clearly in Pissman's dealings with resident delinquent Yoshitsugu. There's a certain derision that always comes with Pissman's internal dialogue regarding this character, which could either be interpreted as an adult looking down on the brash attitude of an impulsive teenager, which just makes Pissman a very immature annoyance of a narrator, or it could be a commentary on how this delinquent character is practically an archetype in anime and manga, following the formula popularized by Jotaro to a T, all the way down to how he talks to his mother. Of course, the reader is probably looking at this character with some form of derision because we've seen this character 100 times before. But Pissman? Well, he does describe Yoshitsugu as a caricature of a juvenile delinquent, but if that's meant to be self-awareness, I can't say the story is doing itself any favors by calling attention to its own bad writing. It's got enough of that as it is. This kind of shooting itself in the foot when it comes to characters is frustratingly common in Raging Loop. Way back in the first loop when rich boy Nosato first comes onto the scene, Pissman is quick to label him as the condescending pretentious type, and yeah, I know that. I was reading the dialogue too. Can I come to a single conclusion on my own without Pissman coming through to rehash what the story just said? We're bringing a new angle to tell don't show here, and we do this with a lot of the characters. But back to where we were in the plot. You use the key you get from being massacred to remove the bullets from their guns and tie up the culprits. What ends up happening is that the villagers hang Mochi and then Shiami voluntarily jumps to her death afterwards. Suicide doesn't count as breaking the rules, I guess. So we won. Right? Is that it? Wolves are dead, the mist disappears the following morning, we won. Seems like a good end. Too good, actually. You leave the village, go back to Tokyo to get your things in order because Pissman genuinely wants to spend the rest of his days in Yasumizu now. You get a fucking wedding ring for Rikako, and then you go back. And, uh-oh. This is my face realizing I still have another fucking time loop to get through. Yeah, everyone is dead, Rikako has been hanged, Pissman jumps into the river to start again. Let's go. Loop 3, the final fucking act. We start by doing the same thing as the second loop, with the whole getting ourselves drunk and talking to the police officer, permanently moving to Yasumizu, tagging along with the journalists, slashing their tires when you get into town, all of that. You get to the decision about the sleeping arrangements. You'll remember that in the last loop, Mamiya spent the night in the student dorms, while Big Boy here stayed in the prefab, which led to him getting killed. Now, I didn't mention this at the time, but the reason Big Boy got killed for staying at the prefab is because the prefab doesn't have a bathroom, so he wandered outside at night in search of one and got killed by the mountain. Also, I'm gonna stop calling him Big Boy now because this man is Yudai Hashimoto, and he's about to be the baddest motherfucker in this entire game. I'm not kidding. Now that you have the key from the end of Act 2, you can choose to stay in the prefab yourself and let Hashimoto stay in the house that the villagers gave to you, preventing him from getting killed by the mountain like in the last two acts. So the mist rolls in and everyone takes shelter. You get some more scenes of Haru knowing shit that she shouldn't know, but that's not important. Because, surprise surprise, we're a wolf now. Yes, at long last we get to be the killers in this feast. In the middle of the night you are woken up by a red mist and, for whatever reason, feel compelled to go outside. While there you meet your future killers in arms, Kaori and Haru. The three of you go to the tree where people get hanged and find the eyes of the wolf gods, the fabled Okami. They tell you information that at this point you already know, about how the wolves work and the rules of the feast and how the badger will show up the next day, and then you go back to bed. Pissman doesn't know what to make of this yet, so he just goes with the flow as things progress. The villagers all gather at the dining hall, and this time no one is dead on the first day, so we finally get our first feast with every character participating. Though we do find a big pile of dog corpses outside the dining hall, don't know why that's there. Anyway, it's feast time. Mamiya is understandably not comfortable with the idea of this hanging feast once it's explained to her, but Hashimoto insists that they just sit back and listen. He's particularly interested in the rules of the feast, keen on gathering as many details as possible. You know from Revelation Mode that while Hashimoto is just as wary of the idea of the feast as Mamiya, he's not the type to have emotional outbursts to this kind of thing. He wants to understand his situation before making any moves. But we run into a bit of a problem at first blush. Last loop, Kanzo suggested that Pissman volunteer to be hanged on the first day, and this time Nosato suggests the same thing. So, why is it that people want to hang Pissman on day 1? No one's dead, and Pissman hasn't, strictly speaking, done anything wrong. Well, the reason is part of the whole game of the feasts. The crow's power is to reveal whether a hanged person was a human or a wolf. The humans can gain an early advantage by having someone hanged as soon as possible. That allows the crow to get to work on the first night. The reason Pissman is brought up in both this loop and the last one is because of how he got into Yasumizu. Recall how we tricked our way in with that whole policeman gimmick earlier. Part of that gimmick is Pissman pretending he is suicidal. He is willing to suddenly move to this sparsely populated rural town because he had nothing to live for anyway, and wants to turn his life around. The people in Yasumizu know about this, so naturally, if someone has to die on day one, the first suggestion would be the person who planned on dying to begin with. So we kinda bit ourselves in the ass with that one. Pissman's only plan is to try and do what he did last time. In the last loop, he survived this conversation by quietly implying he had a guardian spirit and his death would be a problem for the humans. He wants to do the same thing now, but of course he has to be careful. Since he's a wolf and one of the others is the real snake, he'd have to kill them before he can actually claim the role. Luckily, our man Hashimoto has a plan, and it's all about unity. Assuming the rules of the feast are as he heard them, Hashimoto figures that someone will die that night regardless of whether the humans hang someone. The question becomes whether the feast's first hanging should happen today, justifying the wolf's killings in a way, or tomorrow when it would instead become vengeance for the wolf's first victim. Essentially, in order for the feast to progress in a way that's advantageous for the humans have to be united, and what else unites a group of people than a common enemy? The sheer number of people means that hanging someone at random is unlikely to kill a wolf anyway. By allowing the wolves to draw first blood, the humans can come together with a stronger resolve at the next day's feast. This is enough to sow some doubt as to whether a person should be hanged on day one, and rather than voting who will be hanged, the group votes on whether they should hang someone at all. It is ultimately decided that we will be putting off hanging until day 2. Before we leave though, we learn one more point of interest here, that being that Hashimoto and Mochi are the monkeys. While dinner is being prepared, Mamiya dumps a ton of lore on us, which isn't too important other than it leading to the villagers realizing the existence of the badger without Pissman pointing it out, which he did in the previous loop. Well, there's one thing of note during this lore conversation, and it's this. And by this I mean there's some Japanese characters in the text boxes here. We're gonna get into this later, so just keep this in mind. One more pin for the board. We're almost done with those, don't worry. When night rolls around, Pissman makes his way to the prefab and overhears Mamiya and Hashimoto. The act has dropped for them. Mamiya asks if Hashimoto thinks the villagers are serious, and he says, yeah, probably. Hashimoto may have been acting like just part of the group earlier, but in truth he's wary of the villagers. He knows he's an outsider, and more specifically, he thinks that this is a village of slightly insane people willing to murder in the name of superstition. The real monsters are humans after all. But the most important line here comes from Mamiya. Even in occult matters, when someone dies and there's proof, it's always done by humans. Night comes, and in Revelation mode, you can see the spirit of Okami appear to Meiko and reveal her role as the badger. So the wolves have their ally, but it's a little girl, so she probably won't be too useful. Back to Pissman, he wakes up in the middle of the night, he grabs a fancy flashlight that he got from the convenience store, and finds a costume, that of the wolf. He puts it on and goes outside, meeting up with Haru, who's wearing the same outfit. It's hard for them to see in the dark, so he gives Haru the flashlight and she leads the way to Kaori, who's waiting in the dining hall. Pissman realizes that these two are struggling with having to reconcile their unwavering belief in the god of the mountain, the great lord Shinai, with their love for their families. This leads into another one of those annoying conversations like the policeman thing from earlier where you have to pick 2 bad ends to get keys for the third option, which actually progresses the plot, though these bad ends are so short that I can't really be mad at them. If you acquiesce and go along with the idea of killing the villagers, Kaori will kill you and then Haru, believing the best course of action would be if the wolves just died right here and now. But if you try to convince them that you shouldn't kill anyone, Haru will kill you and then Kaori for breaking the laws of the mountain. So instead, you have to trick them. Pissman claims he is a messenger of Kami Fujiyoshi, the village on the other side of the mountain, sent to Yasumizu to fulfill a mission. He pretends he is working on Lord Shinai's orders, using some of his knowledge from previous loops to add to his story. But there is one issue here. If they are going to kill, then Kaori wants to kill her sons first, to put them out of their misery rather than dragging out the inevitable. Pissman reluctantly goes along with this, even though he thinks it's a bad idea that will draw suspicion to Kaori, but that doesn't matter, because on your way to go kill Yasunaga, who do you find but former love interest Chiemi Serizawa, gun in hand. Before you can even speak, she puts the gun to her own head and pulls the trigger. Because of this, Pissman concludes that the wolves can't kill anyone else tonight. Only one person can die per day after all, not including those who break the mountain's rules, so the wolves retreat. I'll add one thing. In Revelation mode, you see what Chiemi was thinking leading into this moment. She originally was going to shoot the wolves here, but she chickened out, believing it better if she just killed herself instead. There's a very specific reason for this, and you'll learn that shortly. But before you go back to bed, something strange happens. As you part ways with Haru, she starts acting weird, the same way she acted when she mentioned knowing that you're time looping before. In truth, Haru isn't only Haru. She is possessed by a god. A deposed god, the guardian spirit of the badger. This god is essentially powerless, living out its days inside of Haru, but this god can read your mind. That's why it knows you're time looping. This little character will become more important later. All you need to know now are its parting words. There are 3 gods living on this mountain. The god of the mountain itself, Lord Shinai, the powerless god living in Haru's head, and the third one, which is only described as your enemy. You might assume that this last god is the wolf god Okami, but it's not. We'll get into it later, and trust me, it's a doozy. For now, it's bedtime. In the morning you learn that Chiemi's body was destroyed overnight. I don't mean with the shotgun to the face, but the rest of her body was damaged by something, presumed to be wild animals. Also, the gun she used is missing. There's some time before we get to the feast, so people split up and Pissman starts wandering around until he accidentally falls off of a small cliff and twists his ankle. He is found by Kanzo, and while the two make their way back, Pissman engages in a little trickery. He starts prodding Kanzo with conversation about Haru and then admits that he had developed feelings for Chiemi and says that she softly rebuked his advances, claiming that she was seeing someone else, but had come to believe that that someone was cheating on her. Pissman heavily implies that Chiemi means that she had been dating Yasunaga, who was in turn cheating on her with Haru. With this little soap opera story, he manages to sour Kanzo's view of Yasunaga, which will come to a head in the feast. Speaking of, it's time for the feast. Obviously, because of the strange nature of Chiemi's death, the villagers are still reluctant to hang anyone, since they don't really know if the wolves killed Chiemi. They think it's possible that she was killed by the mountain for being outside. Hashimoto, however, has questions. During his photography career, he spent time in a war zone, and he has certain knowledge about weaponry. He realizes that Chiemi's death was caused by a point-blank shot to the head. He manages to convince the group that Chiemi committed suicide using a gun, and suggests that they search each house for said gun, since it's currently missing. While the villagers think this is a good idea, they still vote to hang someone. Before they make that decision, however, Hashimoto has one more suggestion. While he still believes the snake should remain hidden, he thinks the entire group should determine who the snake investigates at night. Then the next day, if the chosen person was human, the snake should remain silent, and the group will continue under the assumption that the investigated person was human. On the other hand, if the chosen person was a wolf, obviously the snake would reveal themselves and finger the culprit. This allows the snake to use its powers without risk of being targeted by the wolves, an effective strategy. The group agrees to this, and at this point you should see what I mean when I say Hashimoto is the baddest man in the room. He's a brilliant thinker, and since we're on the wolf side this time around, he is our greatest enemy on the human team, the L to our Kira.
不採取君はどうかな
The group begins the voting, and just like every other time, the old wolfman is voted off for being useless and insane. And just like last time, he asks to prepare his things, and Kanzo punches him, drags him outside, and hangs him on his own. Nighttime comes, and we wake up to commit murder again. With our wolf drip on, we meet up at the dining hall, and there's a problem. Just like yesterday, Kaori wants to kill her sons. The fact that they haven't done so is slowly eating away at her sanity. Kaori plans on killing herself once her children are dead, after all. This is a problem for Pissman because it doesn't benefit them to kill Yasunaga or Yoshitsugu. In terms of the feast, Pissman wants to kill either Takumi or Hashimoto. Takumi because Pissman has realized that he is the snake, and Hashimoto because he is our greatest threat so far. Even though Kaori is losing her grip with each passing day, she allows Pissman to pick the target for that night and that night only, but that's as far as she will go. Regardless of Pissman's wishes, she is killing Yasunaga on the next night. So we get a choice. Kill Takumi or kill Hashimoto. This is another well done choice because neither option is perfect. For plot reasons, the player is naturally inclined to kill Hashimoto. He is the only one of the humans competent enough to defeat Pissman in this game. However, you can't do that because Takumi is the snake and he has chosen to investigate you tonight. So if you kill Hashimoto, Takumi reveals that you're a wolf the next day and you die. So you have to pick Takumi. You go over to his place, kill him in a very drawn-out scene, and I have to heap some more praise onto the soundtrack here. The music that plays when you do your murders as a wolf has a chilling and ominous tone. It really evokes the feeling of strange murders committed in the name of bizarre rituals. You go home afterwards, but the night's not over because someone's at the door, and it's God. Yeah, remember this guy from the first loop? That's Haru. Well, the god possessing Haru, but Haru all the same. You learn a bit more about this fallen god. It was once a feared deity, but it lost its power because the people of the mountains stopped believing in it as centuries passed. That's how the power of the gods works here. A god like the god of the mountain, Lord Shinai, is powerful because he is known and feared by the people of Yasumizu. The guardian spirit of the badger, on the other hand, has been forgotten to time, and it's relegated to a small presence in the back of Haru's mind. After this conversation, God leaves and Pissman goes to bed. In the morning, the villagers learn of Takami's death, and Pissman learns of a new problem. Meiko, the little girl. She's been raising quite a stink recently, constantly yelling about how people should be hanged. Rikako took notice of this and has begun to believe that Meiko is the badger. Pissman becomes very worried about this new development. Since Meiko is the badger, but also a little girl, her actions are unpredictable, and if worst comes to worst, she could out the wolves before they have a chance to claim victory over the humans. But of course, Pissman can't just kill her or anything, so we have to just live with this loud liability. The feast begins, and Pissman claims the role of the snake. In addition, Yoshitsugu reveals that he is the crow. However, this feast is the shortest one in the game. Immediately after these roles are revealed, Yasunaga and Kanzo get into a fight over Haru, and it's hard to put into words how this plays out in a way that'll make sense. But the core point here is that Kanzo ends up attacking the two brothers, and this cripples his standing as the reliable leader of the feast. Believing he has outlived his own usefulness, Kanzo asks to be hanged, and the brothers go through with this. This is the weakest feast by far. In fact, it's the only feast that I don't really like. The usually high quality of writing in the feast is betrayed by this resolution to the soap opera tale Pissman began spinning earlier, and it's hard to judge the sincerity of this moment. It's over so quickly there isn't really time to take in what's happening until it's already over, and even Pissman himself comments on how senseless this is. At this point I can't even tell if this is self-awareness or a product of time constraints or what. It's just strange. But night comes, and like Kaori promised, you have to kill one of her sons today. You can choose which one you kill, and by that I mean you can pick Yoshitsugu and die, or pick Yasunaga and advance the plot. But if you really want to see just how formidable Hashimoto is, you can't miss this bad end. If you go through with killing Yoshitsugu, then Kaori goes insane the following morning, killing Yasunaga and admitting to being a wolf. I mean, she did promise. The villagers tie her up and start the feast, and Hashimoto begins breaking down the situation as it stands. There are only 4 unknowns in the room, those being Tae, Mamiya, Rikako, and Nosato. Pissman makes a fatal error by bringing up the state of Yoshitsugu's body, something that he couldn't have known since the body was cleaned up well before Pissman woke up. When Pissman makes this mistake, it's such a minor statement that the reader might miss it themselves, so Hashimoto taunts you for several minutes as he slowly unravels his thoughts. He figures Kaori's rampage meant that killing her own sons was always her highest priority. If she was stable, then she would have waited until night to kill Yasunaga instead of doing it in the middle of the day and admitting that she was a wolf. So if killing her sons was so important to her, why weren't they the first to die? Hashimoto deduces that this was because the other wolves convinced her to wait because they wanted to kill Takami instead, because they already realized Takami was the snake. Pissman can only watch helplessly as Hashimoto continues, elaborating that none of the 4 unknowns would have had enough sway to convince Kaori not to kill her own children, and thus one of the confirmed humans had to be lying, and all signs point to Pissman. But that's not all. Hashimoto even questions what you're doing in Yasumizu to begin with. It's all too convenient, isn't it? Pissman worms his way into town, gains the bare minimum level of respect, and begins taking part in a feast with such gusto that it seems to Hashimoto like Pissman knew this would happen all along. Of course, this is all true, and then he lands the gut punch, the reveal that you already misspoke as soon as the feast started.
じゃあ、推測でないことを言おうか。
あるならば言ってくださいよ。
なぜ知っていた？
は？
昨夜の犠牲者が織部義継くんだったのは消去法で分かったのかもしれないが、彼の死体のありさまをなぜ君が知っていたのかな。君は知らないかもしれないが、君が起きてくるずっと前に遺体は片付けてしまっているんだ。
何のことですか？
そうだね。とぼけるしかできないね。
何のことか本気でわからないんです。
He knew you were guilty as soon as you sat down. The votes are counted and Pissman is unanimously voted to hang. A complete defeat. But lucky for us, we have magic, so we go back and decide to kill Yasunaga instead. The gang trots on over to Yasunaga's room with Haru leading the way using the flashlight that Pissman gave her. Unfortunately, this is all a wasted effort. The spider chose to protect Yasunaga on this night, so you can't kill him anyway, and this circles back to the problem of Kaori. She's really losing it, and Pissman doesn't know what will happen now that she's been denied killing her sons for a third time. Regardless, the wolves are forced to retreat and we get what is probably the most visually striking CG in this game. And this has been bothering me ever since I first saw it, but does this look familiar to anyone? This might be a stretch, but these faces especially, something in the back of my head is screaming that this image is familiar, but I can't place it and it will haunt me until the end of time. If you have any ideas, please tell me in the comments. This is actually torturing me. Anyway, morning comes and we get to the feast right away, no preamble whatsoever. Without any obvious clues, things quickly devolve into taking turns casting suspicions, but Hashimoto isn't done ruining Pissman's day. With Kanzo's death, Yasunaga became the de facto leader of the feast, but he's starting to crack under the pressure. Having noticed this, Hashimoto suggests the role of leader be transferred to Pissman. With this move, Pissman's every action will be under scrutiny. All it'll take is a single mistake to reveal the truth. It's nothing definitive, but it's one more layer of stress for Pissman to deal with. When the vote comes, Taya is voted off and hanged. Tensions are high and no one really trusts anyone at this point. Relationships have broken down completely. As everyone scatters to their respective homes, Mochi finds us and tells us a few things. The first thing he mentions is that he believes Kaori is a wolf and there's a possibility she was going to poison the food. The second thing he mentions is that he believes Haru and Pissman are also wolves and Okay, real quick, let's get this Mochi pin out of the way. Mochi is a weird character, and not because of the cross-dressing, because you likely picked up at this point, he likes to do that, and the story really likes bringing up that he likes to do that. Mochi cross-dresses, fine. The issue, really, with Mochi, and if I sound tired, it's because I am, is that the story only includes his cross-dressing to amplify a certain weirdness he radiates, which is justified as some kind of magic he has. Not that he's some kind of wizard or anything, but he frequently just blurts shit out without thinking, and the things he blurts out are almost always completely random but thoroughly correct theories that just come to him as gut feelings. Mochi almost always knows who the wolves are, not just in this loop and not because of any important story reason, but because he's a magical weirdo who just knows these things. And no one takes what he says seriously because he's just so weird and always saying strange things. Don't bother listening to Mochi, because his mind is marching to the beat of its own drum. He cross-dresses, haven't you noticed? I said put a pin in Mochi, but really, the pin to be discussed is that he's an archetype, and a tired one at that. Also, Mochi never contributes anything meaningful to the story because again, no one ever takes what he says seriously, and there's no growth on that front, no development, so just take in that he's a charming but poorly written trope of a person, and move on. Night falls and it's murder time again. Here you have 3 options on who to kill: Mochi, Hashimoto, or Yasunaga, and this choice, you may be interested to know, doesn't matter. Although, I'm okay with this choice not mattering because I like the reason behind it. You know how if the wolves try to kill the person the spider's protecting, then they can't kill anyone the next day? Well, this works because the doors on every house are controlled by the mountain. The wolves can unlock and open 1 door per night, and it's the first one that they touch. The spider effectively permalocks the door of the protected person, so when the wolves touch the door and realize it won't open, their chance to kill is wasted because they wasted the 1 door that they can unlock. And Kaori here pulled a fast one on us. She touched Yasunaga's door before meeting up with Haru and Pissman, meaning it doesn't matter if Pissman wants to do something else, because Yasunaga's door is the only one that will open. Pissman is unhappy, but goes along with it on the condition that Kaori ensures she will be hanged the next day. So Yasunaga dies, the day ends, and we jump back into the feast. And, the left side of the room is looking mighty sparse these days. Kaori plays the part of acting insane to try and get everyone to vote to hang her, but who interjects other than our main man, Hashi-fucking-Moto? He says he's 70% certain that Pissman is a wolf, and his proof is as follows. Since Pissman claimed the role of the snake, he has declared 3 people as human, those being Takumi, Yasunaga, and Haru, and of those 3, only 1 is alive. Since the innocence of Takumi and Yasunaga is proven in their deaths, it lends credibility to the idea that Pissman is innocent, but that could be intentional, since a fake snake would know who the wolves are after all. But Hashimoto believes that Takumi was originally the snake due to a few careless words he made on day 1, and if Hashimoto noticed, then the wolves likely did as well. So Hashimoto proposes that Pissman sacrifice himself. If he really is innocent, then the crow will identify that the following day. The group will hang Kaori and eventually manage to corner the remaining 2. If Pissman is a wolf, then the humans will have yet another easy suspect, Haru, the one remaining person who was confirmed human by a false snake. Pissman counters all of this by bringing up the badger, Meiko. Hashimoto had overlooked that the badger inevitably sides with the wolves, meaning that if they hang Pissman and learn that he's human, there will be 2 wolves other than Kaori, who would have 3 votes if you factor in Meiko. So if the humans hang Kaori the next day, that would mean that the wolves had 2 free nights to kill, leaving 6 people total, 2 wolves, Meiko, and 3 humans. With those numbers, human defeat is all but guaranteed, and in a nice callback, this is almost exactly how the first loop played out. Hashimoto relents to this point and decides to put things to a vote. The only way out of this situation is hanging one of 3 people, Kaori, Pissman, or Meiko. Killing Meiko, while an unpopular idea for obvious reasons, is the only decision that is pure advantage, regardless of who's right. But before everyone can vote to kill her, Kaori plays her last card. She jumps Yoshitsugu and tries to kill him. Of course, she is quickly tackled by Hashimoto. My man played college ball.
Could have gone pro if I hadn't joined the Navy.
With that outburst, the priority becomes hanging Kaori, so Pissman, by miracle, lives another day. And I will say, as much as I enjoy the feast scenes, this outcome doesn't really make sense. Even if Kaori has proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that she's a wolf here, there's no reason not to just tie her up and leave her somewhere so that she can be hanged later. I mean, they've done it before. And when things are this down to the wire, wasting a hanging like this is a really bad idea. But regardless, Kaori is hanged and Pissman finally has the opportunity to kill Hashimoto. So he does, at long last. But of course, Hashimoto wasn't gonna let Pissman have the last laugh. He, of course, already knew Pissman would try to kill him, so he discussed a post-mortem plan with Mamiya. He hid his camera in the corner of the room and set it to start recording right around murder time. Unfortunately for our big boy, there are greater powers at work. The recording mysteriously omits the presence of the wolves. It simply cuts from Hashimoto sleeping to his mangled corpse. So the next feast begins and Pissman is holding all the cards. With Hashimoto out of the way and Kaori confirmed as a wolf by the crow, Pissman's position as the snake is virtually unquestioned. He accuses Nosato of being a wolf and Nosato is voted to be hanged. He protests obviously and even suggests that Pissman just shoot him since it would be less painful than hanging, but of course, rules are rules. So Nosato is dragged to the tree, and in a bold move, Nosato ends things on his own terms by jumping off the cliff himself. But his words did spark something. Specifically in Mamiya. Remember a really long time ago at the beginning of this loop when it was suggested that everyone search for Chiami's gun, and then everyone just forgot about that because more dramatic things were happening? Well, Nosato's request to be shot reminds Mamiya that they never did that search, so she figures, hey, better late than never. Everyone agrees because why not, and the houses are searched, and man oh man, Pissman fucked up. Not about the gun thing, they don't find the gun, but what they do find is an interesting little device in Haru's room. A flashlight. A nice one. Something only an outsider would have purchased. And something Haru would have no reason to have if she wasn't going outside at night. With this mistake, Pissman and Haru's guilt is made obvious. Of course, in a pathetic last attempt, Pissman tries to spin another tale, but his words are cut short because Yoshitsugu starts beating the ever-loving shit out of him. Afterwards, the remaining humans tie him up to be hanged at the next feast. You see how there was no reason not to do this when Kaori was acting up earlier? Anyway, night falls, and God pays Pissman a visit. It's nighttime after all, and the wolves have to kill somebody. So, per Pissman's request, the two go to kill Yoshitsugu. Afterwards, Pissman suggests that the two do the same thing Chiami and Mochi did earlier, going scorched earth and killing the remaining humans in the last stand. Upon hearing this suggestion, God beats him with a stick. When Pissman wakes in the morning, he finds that he has been tied up again. Mamiya comes by and drags him to the dining hall, and who happens to be there but God? By appearing in front of the humans in such a desperate time, and with a confirmation from Rikako about how Haru is actually possessed, belief in the deposed badger returns, at least between the remaining humans in the dining hall. And remember, a god's power is dependent on its believers, so with this act, the fallen god has regained its strength. Not just this, but by Haru playing the role of a human possessed by a god, Pissman is given an ounce, or at the very least one more day. Only one person can be hanged after all. With this bizarre display, Haru is the obvious choice. In fact, God asked them to do so that it can leave Haru's body. Thus, Haru is taken to the tree. And if you're playing in Revelation mode, you learn that right before she dies, she whispers to Pissman where she hid Chiami's gun. With those final words, Haru is hanged and Pissman loses consciousness. But of course, he has one more night. So when he wakes, he manages to go out and commit one last murder. Mamiya. When the morning comes, Pissman takes Chiyomi's gun and makes his way to the dining hall. The final four are here: Rikako, Meiko, Mochi, and Pissman. At long last, Pissman reveals that he is a wolf, to the surprise of nobody. Meiko joins him and Rikako leaves, passively asking for Pissman to come get her when it's her time to die. Mochi expresses that he never cared who won the feast, but he is upset that Pissman let Haru die. He also mentions that he believes Haru's possession thing is just an act. He reminds us that it's something she's been doing for years, and the spooky god clothes are something that he, Haru, and Yasunaga made themselves in elementary school. All the same, Mochi proposes a game of rock, paper, scissors. Loser dies. Pissman agrees. Mochi plays finger gun. Pissman plays real gun.
そりゃ、勝てないな。
承認ありがとう。
With his enemies dead, Pissman is victorious, though not for long. While you're cleaning up, Meiko comes to grab your attention, and a choice pops up. And, that is a lot of keys. And of course, you don't have any of them. Jesus Christ, how much more of this game is there? I mean, there's not much left, really, but... I mean this in all honesty. I'd like you to brace yourself. Because there is nothing to prepare you for the shit that you are about to see. Obviously, you can't select this very important looking choice, so you have to pick this choice up here, and, just watch. So, some Lovecraftian being is standing over us, making its way across Japan to destroy it. I am not kidding about any of this, this is not a joke ending. But wait, there's more. Time stops and...
やっちまったな、おい。おい、お前。聞いてんのか、おい。
はい。
やっちまったなって言ってんだ。
あなた、誰ですか？
それは今、どうでもいいだろう。
いや、無理でしょう。というか、羊が喋っている。
状況わかってんのか？この国が滅びるっつってんだぞ今。
化け物が出てくるのと羊が喋るんじゃ受け入れやすさが段違いですよ。
Jesus fucking Christ. Okay, so can you tell I'm slowly losing it here? This fucking sheep shows up and I could not script this shit. I've been complaining for 2 fucking hours now about how this game keeps shooting itself in the foot. We get to this timeline where we are chosen as a wolf. We, against heavy odds, manage to win, killing everyone in the village as the sole survivor. And the payoff to that is this fucking scene where the fucking comedy music starts playing and Pissman starts talking all meta. I'm getting a fucking drink. So, a little explaining is in order. Basically, to boil all of this garbage down to something that is palatable, the way the time loop works is that the feast and everything connected to it are controlled by an unknown individual called the Dreamer. The loop doesn't reset when Pissman dies, it resets when the Dreamer dies. The reason we can keep our memories is because this sheep has special powers of its own. Right before the loop is about to end due to the Dreamer's death, the sheep sends us back to the start of the loop itself. Now, I'll come clean about something I've been hiding from you. If you play the game yourself, this whole reveal may be slightly, emphasis on slightly, less bad. I'll explain. I've structured this video, at least in terms of this reveal, so that you experience the game just as I did. You see, every time you get a bad end, you get your key and you get an option to watch the hint corner. This is exactly what you'd expect, a tiny scene outside of the main story where the game's mascot effectively tells you where you can use the key you just found. Now, me being me, when I first saw that the hint corner was an option, I didn't want anything to do with it. I wanted to figure things out on my own, so as soon as the choice to watch the hint corner came up, I didn't even select yes or no, I just clicked on the chart and began navigating to wherever the key would be useful. But it turns out that if you don't do that and you watch the hint corner, then you will see this sheep. This is the game's mascot, and it not only tells you where to use your keys, but regardless of whether you press yes or no to the hint corner option, you'll get a small cutscene of the sheep sending you back in time to the start of the loop. So, if you actually picked an option here, you would already know that this sheep exists, and you might have already connected that the sheep is the one who's sending you back in time. Granted, you probably assumed it was just a little side character that wasn't part of the main story, but you could have figured this out. However, again, I didn't do any of that shit, so this ending was the very first time I ever saw this sheep. You understand how completely fucking baffled I was when this scene popped up. And to clarify, this scene is bad regardless of whether you already know about the sheep or not. I feel like that's clear, but it's slightly less bad if you didn't skip the hint corners like I did. I can't have been the only idiot who assumed the hint corners weren't a key plot element, but who fucking knows at this point? So what now? What are we doing? What is this story even about? Let's calm down. Deep breaths. Channel your inner Hashimoto. So, with this ending, you get Key 20. With Key 20, you can unlock a choice all the way at the beginning of the game. So, for the last fucking time, we rewind. And don't worry, it's gonna seem like we're about to go through the story again, but trust me, we don't. At this point, we're not getting into feasts anymore, you know, the cool part of the game. Now we're just hopping around the chart collecting keys. Now where's that rewind button? When you start the game, you're greeted with our protagonist, Pissman, famous mystery novelist and acclaimed serial killer, trying to get over a recent breakup through a motorcycle trip in the mountain roads of Japan. He crashes his bike like an idiot and is found by some lady, who takes him back to her apartment and the two get drunk, and here you are given a list of 5 options. One of those options was originally hidden from us, but now we can open it with our newest key, and with this key, Pissman realizes the hints that Chiyomi has been dropping all game. Chiyomi is time looping too. Eagle-eyed players may have already figured this out since she occasionally says things that she shouldn't know, like how she knows you have a motorcycle in the loops where you snuck into the village with the journalist, meaning you never brought your bike into town to begin with. Chiyomi breaks down when Pissman reveals he's time looping just as she is. She has been in this torturous hell for years, constantly reliving the days of this feast, and unlike Pissman, she doesn't retain all of her memories across loops, at least not to the same degree that Pissman does. You can thank the sheep for that. Here she shares some interesting details with us, like how Meiko didn't start showing up until after 50 or so loops, and how Pissman didn't start showing up until a few loops after that. She also clears up a few mysteries, like in the first loop when the old wolfman was voted to be hanged, he wandered into the mist and wound up dead alongside Mochi, and the reason that happened was because the old wolfman killed Mochi for some reason, and Chiyomi saw that and killed the old wolfman in return. This is also why Rikako went insane in that timeline. Chiyomi was corrupted by the mountain for killing the old wolfman outside of the context of the hangings, and Rikako used her bedroom woman servant powers to take the penalty herself. This is also why she just shot herself at the beginning of Act 3. She really did just chicken out of killing you, but it's not like there's consequences for that because she just loops back after dying anyway. She also tells us that Chiyomi Serizawa isn't her real name. She is actually Chiyomi Miguruma, part of the 4th family of Mount Shinai, which ranks higher than Nosato's family, Kaori's family, and Rikako's family. When she was a child, Chiyomi entered a part of the Miguruma household that she wasn't supposed to, and saw things that she shouldn't have. As a result, she was disowned by the family and sent to Yasumizu. With all this extra info and with a permanent ally in the time-looping Chiyomi, Pissman sets out to solve 3 problems. 1. Preventing the feast. 2. Preventing the giant Lovecraft thing from showing up and destroying the country. And 3. Ending the time loops. So you just start throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. You try leaving the village before the mist comes, escaping on your motorcycle, leaving through the surrounding forest, basically anything that Pissman and Chiyomi can think of, they try doing. Eventually, Chiyomi loses hope and just starts killing Pissman over and over for funsies, but after about 100 loops of that, she calms down. Pissman figures something out, and we get a key about Chiyomi's time loop powers, but remember, that really important choice that we need to eventually pick has 5 locks on it, so we're 1 key down, 4 to go. Let's speed things up a little bit. Using the chart, we jump to that conversation in Act 3 where you previously tried tricking Kanzo with the soap opera infidelity plot, and can use the key about Chiyomi and the key about the Lovecraft monster to unlock a new choice. Here you can ask Kanzo about his experience in the previous feast, and you learn that in the last feast, the mist preemptively cleared after only 1 wolf was hanged. Pissman deduces that the mist may just be a natural phenomenon unrelated to the feast, but more importantly, that means one of the wolves from the previous feast was still alive. So we get a key and move on. 2 down. We can get our next key by jumping into the second loop when Mamiya is alone and ask her for some details about spider gods and folklore, since the big Lovecraft being is some kind of spider creature, and Pissman figures that Mamiya could know something useful. We get a key from this, but the information isn't concrete, so we jump even earlier in the second loop. You might remember when I said this. By the way, this conversation we have with Nosato about the abandoned prefab will eventually turn out to be one of the most important turning points in the game, but only once we have the right keys to unlock a choice here. Well, that's now.
野里さんはオタクですね。
君もだろ。
This is the most fun key to get. You walk up to Nosato's house and decide to try and convince him that you're in a time loop. Using your previous knowledge, you can tell Nosato all kinds of things that an outsider obviously wouldn't know, and while he's still suspicious of you, he lets you inside and is willing to hear you out. I won't go into too much detail about this here, but Nosato is one of the best developed characters in the game. Going from some smarmy asshat who looks down on the villagers to the troubled doctor who is impassioned but unsure of himself. This is also developed through his one-sided relationship with Rikako, another pin down, whom he has loved since he was young, and you'll see why in a bit. In the meantime, he tells you about the unpleasant rivalry between Yasumizu and the village across the mountain, Kamifujiyoshi. Pissman figures that the feast as a whole is a plot orchestrated by the leading families of the mountain, primarily the powerful Migurumas, as a means of controlling Yasumizu. That's another pin gone. Furthermore, as the Nosato family have a history of resisting the power of the other families, Pissman and Nosato come to believe that a secret room exists in the Nosato estate, which they manage to find in the basement, and then you get to a really strange choice. The secret room is locked behind a puzzle, which is related to a saying that Mochi brought up once, much earlier in the story, and for whatever reason, this game that has never once shied away from using excessive flashbacks decides that this is not the time to use one. Instead, it gives you 5 choices, and you just have to guess which one is the right one. The 4 wrong answers will all lead to you getting killed by some Scooby-Doo spike trap beneath the floor. I'm just baffled as to why this choice exists. But when you pick the right option, you and Nosato find a bunch of notes written by the deceased head of the Nosato family, who spent the latter years of his life obsessing over the feast, the mountain's rituals, and the Miguruma. And this is where getting this key stops being fun, because from this point onward, it's just lore dumps. Like, lots and lots of lore. Pages upon pages upon pages of lore. So to spice things up a bit, let's talk about the art in this game. The art in Raging Loop is really quite unique. It's a bit different from the typical visual novel fare, but I think it's really well done. The story of Raging Loop is, to a point, fairly grounded, so having these slightly more realistic portraits is a good thing. The art was all done by Kageyoshi, who's a fairly small name as an artist, which is a shame because he's quite talented. And if you look at his Pixiv, he also, really enjoys drawing muscles. And you know what? Kinda based. But while the character portraits and CGs are all really good, I do have some small complaints here, primarily in the usage of these CGs and also some of the backgrounds. If there's one thing that visual novels in general really love doing, it's repeating themselves, and Raging Loop is no exception. You will be seeing flashbacks to these old CGs constantly. And while I get that most players won't exactly be sitting down for 10-hour play sessions and might need a refresher or two during their playthrough to keep track of everything, the frequency with which these CGs show up is distractingly high. As soon as Kaori tries to kill everyone in the first loop and you're greeted with this cool CG, you will quickly grow tired of it, because Pissman flashes back to this picture virtually every time he talks to Kaori for the rest of the story, and he does that with a lot of CGs in this game, but especially with the ones you see near the beginning and end of the game, and it gets real old real fast. And if I can be nitpicky, I do have one tiny issue with the character sprites. You'll notice that whenever a character fades in and out of the screen, but especially when they fade out against a black background, their faces linger for just a bit longer than the rest of the sprite. This isn't Kageyoshi's fault either, it's just how visual novels are programmed. If you don't know, with visual novel sprites, there will very often be a sprite of the character's body and head, while things like expressions or accessories are their own separate images which are layered on top. This is an efficiency thing, it cuts down on file sizes, and also if you want to do things like having multiple costumes for a character, or if you want to change a detail in an existing outfit late in development, then you can do that by just editing a single sprite instead of having to recreate like 200 sprites for each variation. And while this modular workflow is standard, it can lead to this fade out problem, which again is a very minor nitpick of mine. But for the background art, while those are well done too, it's not the actual art itself I have a problem with. In visual novels, you generally want something on screen at all times, so when there's a segment of the story where the protagonist is spending a lot of time just thinking about something on their mind, the background will typically be either pure black or some vague image that looks abstract enough to indicate that this is someone's thoughts. This particular image is a common one in visual novels. The When They Cry series has a similar image you'll probably recognize, and I'm assuming this is so common because this image is really easy to make. If you have Photoshop, you can make it in 20 seconds on your own. No, seriously, here, I'll show you. Open up Photoshop, pick two colors over here, one of them should be black, the other can be whatever color you want, and then go up here to Filter, Render, Clouds, and bam, you're done. See? I don't have an issue with these kinds of backgrounds per se, but when you get to the gigantic lore dumps at the end of Raging Loop, you're going to be seeing a lot of these abstract backgrounds, especially this light at the end of the tunnel thing here. They were probably low on both budget and time at this point, which is why these lore dumps are so rushed to begin with, but it doesn't help that you're staring at this shit the whole time. By the end of this scene with Nosato, you learn a whole lot of shit that isn't important yet, so we'll get back to all that in a minute. The part of this that is important is what Pissman concludes after this scene, the so-called rational explanation for all of this. Why does the mountain corrupt and kill anyone breaking its rules? Because of security cameras and listening devices spread throughout the village operated by the Miguruma. The bodies are so thoroughly destroyed because they are being transported off-site via an underground network of tunnels to be damaged by machinery and the like and then returned to the village. The reason the doors are locked until the wolves touch them? Electronic locks. The reason everyone falls asleep at night without question? Anesthetic gas pumped into every home. And to prove Pissman's point, that same anesthetic is suddenly pumped into the very room Pissman and Nosato are in. They know too much after all, so the Migurumas decided to take care of them. So yeah, that's the big explanation. There is a secret family trying to keep the 12 people living in this poor rural village under control with an extremely elaborate security system consisting of countless hidden cameras spread all over the entire village, secretly converting the locks on every door into electronic locks so that they can be controlled by the family's headquarters, creating a centralized ventilation system that they can distribute large quantities of sleeping gas through, and a network of tunnels hidden beneath the village linking each and every house together. I hope I don't have to explain how stupid this is, but for now let's just collect our key and go. To get our fifth and final key, we have to go back to the very first loop, when Chiemi was shoving us into a toilet to save us from the mountain's corruption. Now we have a choice to go and track down the old wolfman who's hiding out in a dilapidated hut on the outskirts of town. Since the mist is here, the old man starts going somewhere strange, and we tail him until we reach a pathway to the fabled network of tunnels beneath the village. This is where the old wolfman actually lives. He has a little hideout down here in the tunnels. We talk to him for a bit, but he's still acting senile. He gives us a drink, which is almost certainly poison, but we drink it because why not? Pissman brings up one of the things we learned at the Nosoto mansion. Several decades ago in Kami Fujiyoshi, there was a string of 20 murders committed by a deranged serial killer. A culprit was caught and executed on the basis of a confession, but Pissman figures that the real killer is still out there. And what do you know? He's right, and that serial killer is the old wolfman, who's just been pretending to be senile for 60 years now. And you might be wondering, what does this have to do with anything? Why does this matter? Well, the long answer to that is that the old wolfman is working with the Migoduma family on a mutually assured destruction type basis. The Migodumas know that the old wolfman was involved in the serial killings that, I'll repeat, took place 6 fucking decades ago. But the old wolfman has leverage because while he was busy serial killing, he found a contract signed by the Migodumas implicating them in human trafficking. Whoopsie, don't know why they left that thing lying around. So why doesn't the Migoduma family just kill him? Well, the old wolfman has yearly check-ins with a friend in Tokyo. If he fails to show up at this check-in, then the friend will assume he has been killed and leak the contract, which is just about the dumbest thing I've heard in my life. The old wolfman participates in the feast because he just loves killing, and the Migoduma family uses him as an on-site operator when the need arises. He also, incidentally, is the wolf who survived the previous feast that Kanzo was talking about. I already told you this though with the revelation mode thing. But enough of that, the poison you drank starts taking effect and the old wolfman stabs you to death. And at long fucking last, you get the fabled key number 1. Now you can pick that really important choice at the end of the game. When you do, Pissman immediately calls out to the sheep and asks to be sent as far back in the loop as possible. The sheep does its best, and Pissman wakes up a day before he would normally begin the loop. He makes his way to the convenience store and you learn another stupid fucking twist. This cashier is the fucking sheep!
I'm so sick of these people. You know, oh!
She was the sheep the whole time. Why does this matter? It doesn't. Pissman grabs a few things from the store and sets out for Yasumizu. Mission 1, stop the feast. Using some rope, Pissman descends the cliff that people are usually thrown from during the hangings and sets up camp in a hole in the cliff's face. Then he finds Meiko. This is the day she normally wanders into town after all. And then a troubled love interest, Chiemi Serizawa, wanders onto the scene looking quite confused. Pissman promises answers, but for now he gives her a shotgun shell and tells her to shoot God with it. She asks what he means and he says she'll know when the time comes. Thus he prepares for the big performance. At Pissman's request, Chiemi goes into the village and asks everyone to gather around the hanging tree just as the mist rolls in. And when they do, who do they find but God? Well, it's Pissman in a mask, but it might as well be God with the whole mist thing. Taking the role of Okami-sama, Pissman instructs the villagers to put an end to the feast, as the wolf god plans to move beyond and instead transfer the divinity of the mountain to the forgotten god living inside Haru. Pissman again uses his knowledge of all previous loops to say things to each villager that seemingly only this god could know. He instructs the villagers to evacuate through the Saranaga River, and in his final act, asks Chiemi to put an end to Okami's presence on the mountain. So, Chiemi pulls out her shotgun and shoots Pissman, leading him to fall off the cliff. He survives, of course. He planned all of this and had a rope ready to survive the fall. With this little performance, he and Chiemi have effectively killed the god Okami, at least in the eyes of the villagers, eliminating the religious reverence that led the people of Yasumizu to follow through with the feast in the first place, so one job down. Mission 2. Stop the Lovecraft monster. After the villagers leave, Pissman makes his way to the plaza, where he is confronted by the old wolfman, who obviously didn't believe the whole performance from earlier. And You know, the most frustrating thing about this game is that there is some bad writing here that is intentionally bad so that it can be recontextualized later. For example, when you first read Raging Loop, you'll probably think, hey, it's kinda weird that this young woman has invited a random man she's never met back to her apartment and immediately gotten sloppy drunk of her own volition. I mean, it's not unheard of, that might be your life, but it is a bit strange. But then you get to the point in the story where you learn that Chiemi is a time looper and it all makes sense. Pissman isn't a random guy, Chiemi knows who he is and has been in love with him, for decades at this point, even if he doesn't know that yet. But there are also times where the bad writing is just bad, like here when the old man, this late game antagonist, dies by tripping and falling onto his own knife. That's what happens here. This man trips and dies because something had to kill him, so why not bullshit? You drop by the dining hall to talk to the person behind everything, the quote-unquote dreamer, and you may have figured this out by now, but it's Rikako, the Shrine Maiden. Since we're at the dramatic final showdown of the game, naturally it's time for some more lore dumps. If there's anything even fans of this game will agree to, it's that there's way too much exposition in the last leg of this game. The pacing is completely gutted because of all this folklore stuff that goes into way too much irrelevant detail to be interesting. The key part is that yes, Rikako controls the time loops. When she dies, the loop ends. The game can sneak that by you in the first loop because remember, you don't see Rikako die, she just goes insane and is locked away, so you naturally believe that Pissman's death is what ends things. Then in the second loop, Pissman gets a human victory but comes back to find the village massacred and Rikako hanging. She dies just moments after you see her there. And of course in the third loop where you win as a wolf, Rikako is the last person to die since she walks into the mist after you reveal yourself. And if you remember from way back in the video, there are 3 gods living on this mountain. The god of the mountain itself, Lord Shinai, the powerless god living in Haru's head, and the third one, which is only described as your enemy. That last god is the Lovecraft monster, the Tsuchiguma, a spider god who Rikako's family intended to revive. The only thing that Pissman doesn't know is why the feast is needed to revive the monster, and this is when you learn the biggest twist in the game, which is that it was actually written with just one hand. And I get that this was meant to tie in to how Rikako comes from a long family line of women who specialized in the sex trade, but I mean, come the fuck on. If I get to one of your big twists and my only reaction is
call me at 555, come on now,
then you fucked up somewhere. I really hope I'm getting across how bizarre the reception of this novel is to me. People love this fucking thing, and it's so... Chiemi walks in with Mochi, Haru, and Nosoto behind her. She told them the truth of the looping stuff and has come to confront Rikako, having figured out the same thing Pissman did. And then you get to another stupid and meaningless twist, because Pissman's real name isn't Haruaki Fusaishi, that's just a name he made up. This is portrayed as such a cool moment, like it's a real gotcha. The opening music starts playing and shit.
Fusaishi Haruaki って誰ですか? そんな名前の人間この世にいませんよ.
But this is just another tired, worthless twist on a mountain of many. Then the lights go out and Rikako is mysteriously attacked by something, and when the lights come back, her knife is gone and the monster inside her that she's been trying to revive for countless years has been magically killed. Somehow this fucking ending, which most people read, is what's getting all these high-scoring reviews. And I'll clarify for the viewers that have stuck with me for this long-ass video, you learned in Revelation mode, what's really happening here is that Meiko arrived with that black goat god inside her that we briefly went over before, and the black goat kills the spider god in the dark. Just like the sheep reveal, this is a stupid scene regardless. It's beyond stupid. But it's slightly less stupid if you know what really happened. But for most readers who never go through the game in Revelation mode, they don't know this. All they know is that the lights went out, and when they came back on, the main antagonist had been defeated. 10 out of 10.
Yare yare. Yare yare yare.
And then, we can't wrap things up without some more lore dumps, most of which consist of Pissman explaining that God only exists because people believe it and so forth, the same thing as his rational explanation of things from the Nosoto mansion, so mission 2 done. Time for our final mission, dealing with the Migurumas. If you've watched the whole video up to this point, get up and stretch, grab some water, maybe a snack. We're gonna go over some interesting stuff. You back? Okay. So, translating things is really, really hard. This isn't an easy idea to get across to some people, and I can understand that. I've had conversations with people who primarily only speak English who find the difficulty of translating strange. You know, neko means cat, umi means sea, pedo means dog. How hard can it be? Just figure out what word means what and you got it. But the truth is, translating from any language, but especially from Japanese, is not only hard to do, but at times impossible to do. Let me explain. So, you know what wordplay is, right? That stuff you learned in English class. Alliteration is repeating letters across several words, oxymorons are words with contrasting meanings, stuff like that. And of course there's puns, probably the most infamous of English wordplay. So let's take one of the most famous puns of all time. The Beatles. Like, the band, named after both the insect and the musical concept of a beat. The reason this pun works is because the word beat and the first half of Beatle sound exactly the same. So, say you were talking to someone who lived most of their life under a rock. They barely spoke English and had never heard of the Beatles before. How would you explain that pun to them? Let's say you were trying to translate the sentence, "The Beatles are some of the most successful musicians of all time," from English into that rock person's native language. How would you get that pun across if their word for beat and Beatle don't sound the same? The truth is, you probably wouldn't. You'd just skip over the pun and try to translate the sentence in a more literal way that makes sense. Then they would understand the meaning of the sentence, "The Beatles are some of the most successful musicians of all time," but they wouldn't know that there's a pun that they're missing unless you told them. This is the reasoning behind those off-maligned TL notes that became a running joke in old translated anime. Sometimes a phrase, especially if it contains some kind of wordplay, just doesn't translate, no matter how hard you try. And when it comes to translating from Japanese into English, this is one of the most frequent problems you'll come across because the Japanese love using wordplay, and because of their complicated writing system, they're able to use all kinds of wordplay that is impossible to translate into English. This is one of my favorite examples. In the visual novel Sakura no Uta, there is a scene where the narration is describing the interior of a doll shop. In that description, we get this line. If you're the kind of person who listens to videos, then tab in real quick so I can show you something. Don't worry if you don't know Japanese, the important words to focus on here are these two. Shinku and Suiginto, which are the words for crimson and mercury lamp, respectively. So, coincidentally, the names of two characters from the popular anime and manga series Rose and Maiden, which is all about dolls. You see, there's no way you can translate this reference into English. It just doesn't work. If you wanted English readers to know about this, then you'd have to put in a separate note explaining it. But more likely, if this game were to be translated into English, then this reference would probably just be ignored because it's not crucially plot relevant. And that's fine, just as how it isn't really important for the rock person from before to know that the name Beatles is a pun, it's not really important for an English reader to know that this description of a doll shop contains an anime reference. But what happens if this impossible to translate wordplay is plot relevant? Well, then we get to the problems of Raging Loop. Now, far be it from me to decry anyone who goes through with the arduous task of translation, especially translating Japanese visual novels into English. Few visual novels ever get proper translation, so the fact that I'm able to play through and talk about this fully translated game is a feat in and of itself. Full respect to anyone who sits down to make this kind of media more accessible to wider audiences. But there are issues here, especially in regards to all this late game exposition, and a lot of those issues stem from kanji. One more language lesson for you. So, the Japanese writing system is comprised of 3 character sets: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. The first 2 are fairly simple, consisting of characters for each vowel and then characters for consonant-vowel pairs, such as ka, ke, ki, ko, and ku. Not too hard to pick up. The third set, kanji, is significantly more complicated, consisting of thousands upon thousands of different characters, each with multiple pronunciations and meanings that depend on syntactic context. While this is a daunting system, it's ultimately more useful for a reader to have kanji than to not. Take a look at this. These sentences are the same, but the sentence on the top is written using exclusively hiragana, and the sentence on the bottom includes the relevant kanji. If you saw this sentence in a book or a newspaper or something, the sentence on the bottom would be much easier to understand because you know what the kanji means, and you don't have to try and parse the use of the same character over and over again. Whereas if you saw the sentence on top, you probably have to slow your reading down so that you can work out which of these characters belong to which word. Kanji also consists of radicals, basically simpler characters that form the building blocks of more complicated kanji. These are helpful in remembering how to write kanji and can sometimes help with remembering the meanings. This is also where some Japanese wordplay comes in, especially in regards to how a name can change over time, like in Raging Loop. During this scene where we talk to the wolves, the game, of course, gives us some more lore dumps, and part of that is how the kanji has changed since the old days of the village. This ties into some of the exposition we learned at the Nosato mansion, especially in regards to how the name Okami-sama has slowly transformed into Lord Shinai. There's a lot of this kind of wordplay in Raging Loop, both as part of major twists and as early foreshadowing, and put simply, this isn't something that an English reader would be able to understand because it just doesn't translate over. If you'd like a more in-depth look at all of this, a professional in Japanese translation wrote an article breaking down the issues in Raging Loop with special emphasis on the problems with the kanji. I'll link it in the description. If you're interested in learning about the Japanese language, it's a really fascinating read, if a bit pedantic at times. Now, the reason we went over all of that is because it's time to get into the biggest headache of the game. Pissman and Chiemi go talk with the Miguruma, the real wolves behind everything, and the entire time, they talk to you in this fucking awful medieval-ass English, and let me explain why this is so fucking annoying. So they did this once before, back when we were a wolf and they appeared to us in the Red Mist to explain how the wolf role worked. Now the game obviously assumes that you don't know this old form of English, so Pissman just translates every line for you as they speak it, so you're reading every single sentence twice over. And it's not as if it's hard to suss out what most of these words mean anyway. The grammar structure is virtually the fucking same as the English the entire rest of the game is written in. The only difference is that the letters are jumbled up and there's more apostrophes to deal with. You know that phenomenon where you can mix up the letters in a word and as long as the first and last letters remain the same, then you can still read it? It's basically that. If you can read this up here, then you can read this down here. So Pissman's translation is barely helpful to begin with. Secondly, since Pissman is translating the Middle English into Modern English as it pops up, we can assume he already knows Middle English, right? And if that's the case, why didn't he use any of that when he was pulling his fake god facade in the final timeline? If you're really putting all your hopes on one performance, wouldn't you want to go with the same ancient language that you already know through the feast that the villagers will fall sway to and apparently all understand? Thirdly, why is this here? And I don't mean from a translation standpoint. The reason they're speaking Middle English is because they're speaking an old form of Japanese in the original. That's not my question. I mean, why is the story making me read every line twice over? What is the point in having this ancient language? The characters, I assume, are doing it to maintain an air of ancient mysticism around their whole wolf persona. So I get why they're talking to Pissman like this, but why are they talking to me like this? It's not as if their ancient mysticism facade works on the reader because the reader already knows that they're bluffing, so who benefits from this? A visual novel has more ways of storytelling than just text. Why not have it so that the voice acting is performed in ancient Japanese, but the written text is still, readable? Like how subtitles work. The shit has been solved, Raging Loop. Let's not try to be too clever because we're just putting more rounds in the revolver as we continue shooting ourselves in the fucking foot. Anyway. You argue with the Miguruma wolves, and by argue, I mean read lore, until the wolves give up and leave. Chiemi briefly reminds Pissman that her real last name is Miguruma, and she technically belongs to the same family as these wolves, but like every reveal in the last act, it doesn't really matter. Mission 3, fucking accomplished. So you meet up with Chiemi and the cashier/sheep, and okay, you may remember near the beginning of this video, I mentioned that this cashier is the worst character in the game, which is true, but more importantly, this character is emblematic of the storytelling faults that plague Raging Loop. So let's talk about unreliable narrators. In an admirable attempt to add an element of replayability to their fairly linear visual novel, the minds behind Raging Loop added that revelation mode that I've been mentioning, which is unlocked upon completing the game's true ending. With this, you can reread through the story with additions or revelations, which are these text boxes with the red glow on them. The content of these red text boxes is entirely new stuff, added in so that you can read through the story with a greater knowledge of what each character is thinking in the moment. Things that wouldn't have made sense to have in your first playthrough since you didn't know the twist of the story just yet, and at its best, this mode gives you access to completely new scenes following what characters other than Pissman are doing at certain points in the story. On the surface, this is a clever idea, and some scenes are significantly more interesting when you read through them with this mode on. However, Revelation Mode belies the poor implementation of the unreliable narrator. Part of the use and appeal of the unreliable narrator as a device is having to suss out on your own how much of the narration was just lies and to what benefit. To go with an example that viewers of the channel are likely familiar with, take the game Danganronpa V3. In the first chapter of that game, you take control of Kaede Akamatsu and set out to investigate the murder of Rentaro Amami with the help of your detective friend Shuichi Saihara. You follow the investigation from the very start, but during the trial sequence when you have to deduce the identity of the killer, you realize that Kaede herself was responsible, committing the crime and messing with evidence by omitting details in the narration. This chapter and its trial are particularly memorable because of how effective the unreliable narration is. Going back through the story knowing that Kaede is the killer, you see all these hints when she's lying to you that you likely missed your first time around, and this isn't done just for the sake of having a twist. It builds on the characters of both Kaede and Shuichi by demonstrating where friendship and trust can blind you to things you don't want to see. In a well-written story, the reveal of the unreliable narrator is enough on its own to breathe new life into old scenes. Then back to Raging Loop. Revelation Mode takes the unreliable narrator as a device and guts it of all of its effect by allowing you to see exactly what Pissman was hiding from you the first time around, and again, this seems like an interesting idea on paper, so let's go back to the game's opening, when Pissman first stumbles into the convenience store looking for directions. On your first playthrough, this is a slightly comedic scene set between Pissman and a blunt/bored cashier. But on your Revelation Mode playthrough, you get to see something that I've actually been hiding from you for 30 minutes now. You see, the cashier is not just the magic sheep from before, the cashier is also your ex-girlfriend. You know, the one Pissman broke up with right before the story begins? The game actually tells you this after you loop back here for the final time in the true ending. And we're not even going to get into the whole, so this girl isn't just a magical sheep, but also his ex-girlfriend that he's been dating since well before he got wrapped up in the supernatural time loop stuff. Also, was he dating a sheep? Like, we're not going to touch any of that. Have fun with that on your own time. In this opening scene with Revelation Mode on, you get all this extra internal dialogue from both Pissman and the cashier about how they recognize each other, obviously, but are playing a coy little game of pretending they don't know each other, and this little game carries throughout the entire interaction. Who does this benefit? What kind of writing is this? I can see two salty exes pretending that they don't know each other if they have a run-in at a store, but the length of this scene and the events that transpire in it indicate that neither party has any adequate reason to carry this game on for as long as they do. No, this was a narrative omission that was done for the sake of the audience, something that Pissman hides from you just so you don't figure out that the cashier/sheep is his ex until the story wants you to know that, which is a hallmark of really bad writing.
So he was only calling her Lucy for the benefit of an omniscient narrator who might accidentally spill the beans too soon.
This is the same issue as with another reveal at the end of the game, which is that Pissman really is a mystery author and not a college student. Not only is this an omission made for the sake of the audience and no one else, it is similarly meaningless. Pissman has no reason to hide his profession from us, and the only reason he hides it from the villagers is because his novels are famous, but it's not like that really matters either. There are several times in this story where Pissman just lies to you for no fucking reason, and Revelation Mode makes that abundantly clear. There's no motive to suss out as to why Pissman is an unreliable narrator, no reasoning behind it, no character building behind it. He just lies so that the game can hide information from you without putting in the effort. So the game ends. Pissman returns to Tokyo, confident that everything he experienced was all a fiction, a fantasy he was having, which is a patently absurd thing to say, and he goes back to his everyday life as a mystery novelist. Sometime later, Chiyomi shows up at his house for a visit, and I can't get over how silly this scene looks. It's unintentional, but because the background is just this big stack of books, it looks like Chiyomi is just 5 inches tall. Anyway, the two get on Pissman's bike for a date, and credits roll. The ending of Raging Loop is the most commonly cited issue with the game as a whole. Even those who write up glowing reviews of this game will usually leave a caveat of, game was good but ending was rushed, confusing, and full of way too much exposition, which is all true, it is all of those things. With Revelation mode, you can sort of get a clearer idea of what's going on, but there's still a lot of garbage left unaddressed. And that's not even to speak on the fact that if you need to add a post-hoc game mode to explain main story content, then you've made mistakes somewhere. The average reader should expect bonus content to be, a bonus. But regardless, after getting the true ending here, you unlock 5 side stories called extras. These all range in genre and length, and while they can be interesting reads, I'm too fucking tired. I'll tell you one of the highlights, which is from the last extra, the one labeled a documentary. This is a story told from the perspective of that stupid fucking sheep. There's even more lore here, so if all that exposition from the last leg of the game was your favorite part, you're in luck. Most of this is to connect Raging Loop to other games the developers made in the same universe, which is also why Mako has that black goat thing hanging around here. That's our last pin gone. But the real center here is the revelation about Pissman. You remember when I said that a fault in the writing is that Pissman is never wrong? Well, that's not just a writing quirk, that's part of the canon. The sheep works for a secret organization that investigates superpowers around the world and suspects that Pissman himself has a certain superpower where if he encounters supernatural phenomena and comes to believe there's a specific rational explanation behind it, then that rational explanation is forcibly imposed on the universe. He makes the unreal real. And all I can say is
I need you to shut the hell up for the immediate future.
So that's it. That's the fucking game. Before we end all of this, I just have one more question about this game and its writing. And that question is about sincerity. How much of this game was written in good faith? That's not a critique of the writing, really. I've laid out my problems with the writing in more detail than you probably wanted. This is an honest question. My critiques are made under the assumption that this game was made in good faith. This game was trying to create an interesting mystery story, and unfortunately started stumbling over itself as it got closer and closer to the end. There was an effort made, but it just so happened that the execution was sloppy. Nothing wrong with that, really. The attempt itself is admirable, but there are things in this story that make me question all of that. The fact that several of the characters are just lazy tropes and the game calls attention to it, the fact that there's that little soap opera subplot where Pissman tried to trick Kanzo into hating Yasunaga, and when it comes to its big resolution, Pissman mocks the idea that any of the villagers actually care about it. The fact that in several of the game's major moments, it undercuts its own dramatic tension with bad jokes. The fact that both of the main antagonists are taken out by shit you didn't even know about in the main story. The fact that you go through what you probably assumed was the last arc of the game only to unironically learn it was all a dream, one that's partially run by a sheep. And even in the end, when it gets to all those awful lore dumps that even the game's biggest fans will criticize, the theme of the game shifts into a bad attempt of pitting mystery against fantasy without any effort to make that contrast work. This isn't like a certain significantly better story that creates a mystery versus fantasy angle. No, what this story did was present you with a fantasy and then tell you via its infallible narrator that it was all just an extremely convoluted bit of mystery that even he doesn't have all the answers for. You've probably heard that old Sherlock Holmes quote, "When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth." And it really is telling that the icon of mystery fiction is the biggest proponent of implausible plots. I enjoy reading murder mysteries as much as the next person, with all the fantastic murder weapons that authors have tried to devise to stay one step ahead of an increasingly meta-aware audience, but I can't help but think that on some level we're all... what's the word? Flanderizing the genre. It's hard to set a murder mystery in the modern day because everyone has cell phones and the police are rarely out of reach and alibis are a dime a dozen, so you always have to have a sentence about why this particular locked room is in a place just outside of cell service. You can't kill someone with a gun or a knife because that's way too boring. It has to be a series of 200 masks or an ice cube that melts at just the right time, or some convoluted plot where you're mixing and matching the parts of 6 different corpses to create a woman of alchemical perfection. I mean, mystery fiction is just so far gone. And I love mysteries, I really do, but it's so hard to find a mystery that's not just a good mystery, but just plain good fiction, you know? Anyway, sorry, I kind of got away from myself there. Next video will be more positive. Raging Loop, it's fine, not great, like a strong 5. Bye! I'm sorry, what?